All right, welcome. Thank you. Glad to see you all here. We got a room of almost 200 nerds. I'm sure the nerds will pile in. Maybe we can get up to about 300 tonight. We'll see. It's your boy, Jay, in the house. Your boy. Can't see me. Welcome. This is another installment of Jay's Analysis. Thank you guys for joining me. This is your boy, Jay Dyer. And I've got a couple friends with me tonight. On that scholarly tip, we got Mr. Lewis. I think you guys all know Lewis. And then we've got Mr. Ubi Petrus, our scholar in residence. I can't talk tonight. So I want to thank you guys for coming on. We're going to be hitting on the topic of refuting and responding to the papal claims. So we just got kicked off here. Hopefully we have some more people coming in. We got, 100 right away. So if you would, give us a like and give us a share if you are so inclined. We will be taking super chats tonight, so give us some good questions. We've got some scholars in the house. This is going to be good stuff tonight. You're going to get some pretty hardcore info. So get your notepads out. Get ready to take notes. But without any further ado, let's talk to our guests. We've got Lewis. What's up? Lewis is going to MC for us. And then we've got Ubi Petrus.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure.
Can everybody hear those guys good? Do we need to up the volumes any before we start yapping?
Mic test.
Microphone check.
All right, mic test.
All right, I think you guys sound pretty good.
All right.
Thumbs up. Everybody says it's good. And
I don't think the avatars are up though.
I know. I'm going to put them up right now. So sometimes the JPEGs won't work, so I have to fix that. So anyway, go ahead and kick us off while I do that, Lewis.
All right, so I guess we could just briefly explain what Ubi Petrus is. Basically, me and Ubi are a team. We run a blog together. He is the brains behind the blog. He writes the articles, and all I do is edit and offer critique and manage the WordPress. Would you like to explain how we met, Ubi?
Yes. Well, you're too kind. I'm really not much of brains. It's more so in the editors. But the way that we met was on Jay's Twitter feed, and we began discussing various topics we'd seen in the articles, and from there decided to start a blog together.
Yeah, and you guys have done great work. I mean, you've put out a tremendous amount of scholarly work within a pretty short span of time. It's extremely detailed, very scholarly, and I think that that's what's needed at this time is that kind of response. That's what we try to do at my site and on my channel as well. So thank you guys for coming on. But so I'm going to let Lewis take over for emceeing tonight. He is going to kind of take us through our topics. We're going to touch on some of the argumentation of other apologists that you guys are all familiar with. We all know about Taylor Marshall. We all know about Mr. Ibarra. We're going to be responding to specifics. We're going to be responding to some of the sort of quote mined pat response, the quick response stuff, Catholic answer style stuff. We're also going to touch on some of what Taylor Marshall and Flanders talked about. So we want to hit that topic too. And then some of the typical biblical exegesis passages that are misused, specifically Matthew 16, that kind of stuff. So kick us off, Lewis. Take us down this trip.
All right, so I thought it would be best to not be what Flanders says we are. which he calls us a theology of negation. He says that we actually don't propose any doctrines, which is totally ludicrous. So I thought I would do it in this order. So what Ubi is the concept of the papal primacy in Orthodoxy, and then could you contrast that to the Roman Catholic concept of papal primacy according to their dogmas, and then Jay can evaluate that, and then we can move on to the next part.
Yes, I could do that. The concept of primacy within the church or just within any institution is one of someone being first, someone being preeminent, someone being a leader within that group. And it is oftentimes misunderstood in terms of one person being a boss or a dictator or able to simply call the shots without the permission of others. In the Catholic Church, that is actually what it has become, is a super bishop who can simply give orders and you follow them. Even the Second Vatican Council, which some consider as an attempt to back away from the more hardline dictatorial concepts in the First Vatican Council, in Lumen Gentium, chapter 25, it states that even when the Pope is not speaking ex cathedra, you are bound to obey him. He can say, quite frankly, I mean, realistically, he could say nearly anything. I mean, you would just, well, you know, Rome has spoken, okay. In the Orthodox Church and in the first millennium, the topic was much more nuanced, and the Pope acted as more or less like a patriarch of the world, you could say. He was like an archbishop of the world, is a term that St. Cyril of Alexandria uses to describe Pope Sixtus. But in so doing, the job of the Pope is to confirm the decisions of the other bishops because he is the head of the synod. So this idea that the ratification of the Pope would be needed for an ecumenical council in normal circumstances is an Orthodox Christian belief. One of the ways that the Council of Hieria, the Iconoclast Council, was dismantled was it was said, well, Rome did not agree to it. Only two patriarchs were present. But it's not that in Rome being able to confirm a council that they can just simply start dictating to the council what they want them to do, and then the council simply rubber stamps it. There is a gentle back and forth between the head and the members, in the same way that there's a gentle back and forth between an archbishop and his synod of bishops. The two mirror one another in the first millennium. And you're starting to see the Catholic side admit this more and more recently, especially a very good book for a summary of it is Byzantium and the Roman Primacy by the Catholic priest, Byzantine Catholic actually, Father Francis Dvornik. Mm-hmm. He wrote the book sometime before the Second Vatican Council. And it's very short. It's, maybe about 160 pages. Another book to read if you're interested in sort of how the papacy developed into what it is now is a book by another Catholic priest, Father Klaus, that's Klaus with a K, Schatz. And the name of the book is Papal Primacy from its Origins to the Present. And they give a very, I would say, fair and balanced view of how the papacy has moved from something that is really an archbishop or sort of an archbishop to the archbishops, how it has moved from that to something where it's essentially an autocracy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, I read one of the first books I read when I was Roman Catholic was on this topic specifically was the Dvornik book, and I thought it was really well written, and he actually has influenced quite a few Catholics, especially in the Uniate world, and even normative Roman Catholic apologists take account of that work now, and they kind of do some revision on Saint Photius, and they say, oh well, maybe Photius wasn't that bad of a guy, and all this kind of stuff. So there's been a lot of like you said, admissions, especially after Vatican II, and actually prior to Vatican II, there was quite a bit of Roman Catholic scholarship that was moving in the direction of kind of shying away from the rather extreme views of Vatican I. However, Vatican I is already set in stone, so there's no going back. You can't change and revise Vatican I, at least not in theory, on trad Roman dogma, because it's specified very clearly. You mentioned Lumen Gentium. Actually, you can go back to Vatican I, where there's, I think, 3 or 4 statements within the text of Vatican I that talk about the necessity of believing the Pope's ordinary universal magisterium as well as the extraordinary magisterium. And then for the stuff that's not universal ordinary magisterium, you still have to hold to it with the word, the phrase they use is with docility and full assent. So even if you purposefully or internally disagree with something that Francis does or something like that, you still must submit with docility to his normative teaching, regardless of whether you personally classify it as ordinary universal magisterium or normative ordinary magisterium, which could theoretically be fallible. It doesn't really matter, because in practice you still have to submit to it. So I think these are great points to highlight, and the key here is to stress that, like Ubi says, we don't deny a lot of the quotes, right, or a lot of the usages of texts that will be brought forward in these kinds of debates. What we deny is that this was an ever-present, consistent mindset from the beginning, and that it's not something that evolved out of things in Scripture. Peter being the coryphaeus of the apostles, the mouthpiece of the apostles, the idea of Rome having the first position in sort of signing on to different councils and creeds. The claims, like Ubi mentioned, of what St. Cyril said, that sort of moving from something that's synodal, canonical, that is first among equals, moving to this like radical position based on a lot of forgeries. We know all this now, the Samachian forgeries, the Galatian decretals, the Isidorian decretals, the donation of Constantine, on and on and on. And it just evolves, I think, very clearly over many centuries into something that comes to fruition in the split. I mean, there was already problems prior to the split, but it just really comes to the fore at the time of the split, the schism between the East and the West. And so the two churches clearly go in different directions. And the full summation of this is really Vatican I. The easiest way, in my view, to really lock down Vatican I, or Roman Catholic theology, and to sort of refute it, is to get into the specifics of Vatican I, contrast it to what you see in the first millennium, and then contrast it to kind of the pendulum swinging in the opposite direction after Vatican II. So you're absolutely right to hint on things like the Chieti documents, which now speak of not just collegiality, but admitting that the Vatican I mindset was not the normative approach during the first millennium. So, Lewis, if you want to jump back in and be our MC.
Well, but if it's all right, may I add something?
Yeah, sure. I think maybe Lewis drop. I don't know if
I was just wondering if I could, on top of what you're going to add, I was going to wonder if you could add whether or not there is a divine aspect to the institution of the papal position, and could you explain a little bit about the specific prerogatives of the Pope in terms of appellate jurisdiction?
Yeah, I'll let Ubi talk on that.
Yes, the Pope had appellate jurisdiction. So in the current Roman Catholic scheme, the Pope has universal jurisdiction, which we do not deny. We just deny the type of your universal jurisdiction. Furthermore, his jurisdiction is ordinary, right? It meaning that it is vested in his office. Then he has immediate jurisdiction, not mediate. Immediate meaning the Pope, if he so wanted, could go over the heads of all of the bishops, the priest, straight to a parishioner, and say, I'm excommunicating you directly. or I am taking you and ordaining you a priest, or whatnot. And no one could really do anything about that. Immediate jurisdiction, the Pope would act through a synod, or he would attempt to, contact the bishop who could handle it. Now, the Pope, I cannot think of an instance in which he actually has said, this random person in this parish in Kansas City, I'm just going to, excommunicate. But he could do that in theory. There's nothing that could stop him. And he would just have to go with it. I know that the trads will oftentimes say, well, if the decision of the Pope is unjust, you don't have to go with it.
Well,
okay, so you're going to out-interpret the Pope.
Yeah, exactly.
You're going to just sort of ignore him. I mean, there really is this attitude among trad Catholics, of which I was one for a while, of well, the Pope is infallible. The Pope is, has universal ordinary jurisdiction. When I agree with him.
Yeah, I mean, and that doesn't work with, I think in a couple previous streams, we've actually pointed out, I think there's at least two places in Denzinger where it's stated very explicitly that you do have to follow the Pope's juridical decisions and the decisions of the Roman congregations, including the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, etc. So if there's a decision that's like a juridical pronouncement in relationship to some excommunication, you have to follow that. Denzinger is very clear. That was one of the problems, for example, with the SSPX, is that they make the decision to reject the excommunication of Lefebvre by John Paul II, which Denzinger's unambiguously clear based on Vatican I that you have to follow the Pope's juridical decisions. You can't arbitrarily reject them. And just think how ridiculous it would be if you could in that system. I mean, you could then reject any juridical decision of the Holy Office or the Roman bishop. So the whole system,
absolutely,
the whole system would fall apart. Let me ask you a question, Ubi. Do you think that there, like Lewis asked, would you say there is a divine aspect to the role of Peter in terms of his successors at Rome? Or would you say that the later prerogatives are purely kind of canonical privileges?
It is both, I believe. I would follow St. Maximus the Confessor, who says it's both. Going back to that idea of appellate jurisdiction, we have plenty of examples from the first millennium of clerics appealing to Rome for a retrial. And the way that this was based on the canons of Sardica. Right. It's a council, and we're not really sure when it was. It was sometime between 340 and 343. The general date is 343, but the third and fifth canons, namely, state that if a cleric is deposed and he considers his deposition unjust, he can appeal to Rome. And furthermore, that the Pope can review his case, decide whether or not he needs a retrial, and then send it to a retrial. But it stipulates that retrial must be done by the bishops in a territory that is adjacent to the territory of the bishop who has been deposed. Furthermore, if the Pope believes that bishop will not get a fair trial, the Pope can send some of his own people to join those bishops and sit on panel with them to be, persons who vote, persons who make decisions. Mm-hmm. And moreover, it says that cleric cannot be, if they appeal to Rome, their position cannot be filled by another until Rome has either decided that cleric can or does not deserve a retrial, in which case the deposition stays, or that, I believe the number is twice, that goes to retrial twice and is shot down both times. So in this case, Rome is not a last court of appeals. Rome is a review court that will then send you to an appeals court. This was later, Constantinople took this over in Canons 9 and, was it 16 or 17, in which it says that the Patriarch of Constantinople can do much the same, that you can appeal to him and that he can review your case. The difference was that the Patriarch of Constantinople would hear your case directly. He was not simply a review court, he was an appeals court. And following this model, a similar thing begins with Rome, where people begin appealing directly to Rome, not as a review court, but as an actual appeals court.
That's a great point.
May I just say, does not the mere fact that such canons of Sardica exist, these councils giving privileges to the See of Rome, evidence that this is not a Pastor Aeternus view? This is not a Pastor Aeternus church?
Yes. Pastor Aeternus denies that it's canonical, that it was given directly from Christ to Peter.
Yeah.
So to clarify, the bar of evidence, because we don't believe that this view is unfalsifiable, the bar of evidence for the Roman Catholic apologist is to show a consistent presentation of the entirety of Pastor Aeternus all the way through the first millennium, because Satis Cognitum explicitly states that this belief in the divine office of the papacy is the venerable belief of every age.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me ask you a question, Ubi, before you go on, because that's something I wanted to bring up. A pattern I've noticed amongst Roman Catholic apologists is the desire to, on the one hand, follow that older apologetic model that you see in Satis Cognitum of saying that the full understanding of this jurisdiction, of this immediacy, of this full supremacy view was always there. Look at Pope Clement, look at Pope Victor, look at the actions of Victor. Therefore, it's always been there. And at the same time, and this apologetic actually becomes a little more popular at the time of Vatican I and afterwards, which is the idea of evolution of dogma, where they begin to say, well, there were the seeds of this there was the ideas of this. It wasn't always really exercised. And so it took a long time, really, for the church, a la Cardinal Newman, to come to its self-understanding of what the office of the papacy actually was. And so it's something that rather developed. So you see this strand, these two different strands amongst Catholic apologetics of, on the one hand, wanting everything of Vatican I and the rather expansive claims of Vatican I to always be present, and at the same time, and sometimes I've even seen Catholic apologists use these two different contradictory claims, say, well, the full idea of Vatican I wasn't always there. It's like a seed that grows into a tree, and it kind of developed over time. Do you think that's a valid criticism from your vantage point?
Well, I mean, their only defense is to use the acorn and the oak tree analogy. There's nothing that you could possibly do. But I mean, yeah, your criticism is correct. They do try and use both of those. They try to use the best of both worlds, and you do see a very interesting place where what's his name, Cardinal Ratzinger, before he was Pope Benedict XVI, he puts forward his Ratzinger formula, in which he says the East can reunite with Rome, or Rome can reunite with the East, however you'd like to put it, and they can basically retain all of their dogmas, everything that they have. They don't have to accept anything else. And then the key sentence right at the end is he says, the West would recognize the Church of the East as orthodox and legitimate in the form she has always had.
Right.
So right there, he's saying that the East has not changed. Okay? So how does he then justify the fact that there's difference between the two, right? There's difference.
Yeah, he's got
between
two great quotes.
The Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, he's got two. He's got a quote in Introduction to Christianity where he essentially says the same thing as well. He says we shouldn't expect more of the East than we've always expected of the East, which is to honor they can have their own way of doing things as long as they admit some sort of place of primacy for the Roman bishop. And he admits in there that they've always operated this way, right? And then in another book, he says something really close to that even Ibarra had to do a whole essay trying to defend, that the ultramontane view of Vatican I actually wasn't operative in the first millennium, and the first millennium was operating more like the Orthodox Church. So Ratzinger's got
Exactly.
two famous quotes like that they actually constantly try to defend, which is just fascinating that that's being admitted. And the reason I bring up the irony there is that you've got these apologists, like people are saying in the chat, like Stephen Ray, who will write whole books defending the papacy on the basis of the evolution of doctrine, the evolution of it, seeds growing into trees, at the same time as the older tradition of Satis Cognitum says it was always there, it was always present. And the irony is that the liberalism of Vatican II is always argued for on the basis of evolution of dogma. So the very same popes who condemned the evolution of dogma, namely, you can go back to Pacindi Dominici Gracious, you can look at Lamentabili Sane. Those documents from the papacy explicitly condemn the evolution of dogma, and yet at the same time, the bases of many of these sort of Novus Ordo conservative apologists is to utilize the notion of the development of doctrine to prove the papacy, even though the development of dogma has already been condemned by the papacy. And so they were more consistent in the days of Leo XIII.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to the biblical citations that are most commonly used both in the Vatican clarifications on Vatican I and in Vatican I itself. Let's look at, first of all, the classic, the original, Matthew 16, verse 18. Ubi, what is Matthew 16, 18 really saying? If it's not saying that the Pope is Peter is himself the rock, what about the keys? Are those unique to the papal office? And how can we talk about this?
Well, the rock is both Peter and it is his confession of faith. I know people usually cite that one study by, I don't remember his name. I think he was a French priest, saying 70% of fathers say this or that. Well, no, it's more nuanced than that. Many of those same writers say that it is both the faith of Saint Peter and Saint Peter himself. The issue, though, is that the church fathers, the undercurrent in their understanding is that all bishops are Peter.
Right.
And so you have these great quotes, like here's one from Saint Cyprian of Carthage. It comes from his 26th epistle. He says, "Our Lord, whose precepts and admonitions we ought to observe, describing the honor of a bishop and the order of his church, speaks in the gospel and says, 'Peter, I say to thee, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bound on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven.' Thence, through the changes of times and successions, the ordering of bishops and the plan of the church flow onwards, so that the church is founded upon the bishops, and every act of the church is controlled by these same rulers." So you take everything that St. Cyprian says about the chair of Peter, he's talking about bishops, right? That's one example there. We have another one from St. John Chrysostom.
So in a sense, Peter as the rock is a biblical type of the episcopate. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. You have this great story from, let's see, who was it here? I'm trying to find it. Oh, I can't find it. You have St. John Chrysostom, who in his books on the priesthood, he is trying to justify why he avoided ordination to his friend Basil. Not to be confused with St. Basil the Great, but another Basil. There were many Basils, right? And he starts out by saying, this is how incredibly difficult it is. And he starts citing the papal proof texts. You can find that in St. John Chrysostom's Book 2, chapters 1 and 2 of On the Priesthood. And then you have other quotes from people like St. Isidore of Seville, who says, "So Peter first received the power of binding and loosing, and he first led people to faith by the power of his preaching. Still the other apostles have been made equal with Peter in a fellowship of dignity and power. They also, having been sent out into all the world, preached the gospel. Having descended from these apostles, the bishops have succeeded them, and through all the world they have been established. and the seats of the apostles. So he's saying right away that the other apostles are exactly what St. Peter is.
Yeah. I've got. Go ahead.
And that all the apostles, that they take their lineage ultimately from St. Peter, that he was the one who ordains them. He consecrates them. They are all Peter.
Yeah, there's a great discussion of this in Sermon 26 by St. Augustine, which if you got this set, it's right here, and it's really a whole sermon on this section of Scripture, Matthew 16. And what's interesting, again, I know that this gets really deep, and I'm not opposed to getting really deep to those out there in the audience who want to discuss the Matthew 16 and the John text and all that. You can kind of drown yourself in looking at the patristic exegesis, which I'm not saying don't do, but when you do it, what you'll notice is that the church fathers aren't all perfectly unified on this text. But it doesn't really matter that they're not unified on this text, because all that we have to demonstrate from my vantage point to show that we're correct is that the Vatican I mindset is not present. Okay, if I can show that the Vatican I mindset is not present, then the Vatican I argumentation of like Leo XIII, Satis Cognitum, and all the encyclicals around that time period, that's all I have to do is to show that it's a development, right? And if it's a development, then it's not the doctrine of the first millennium, because the first millennium, as we've said, it's not developing. So when we look at, and we can look at multiple texts in the church fathers exegeting Matthew 16, and what you'll consistently see is what Ubi just said. You'll find Augustine here basically repeating what Ubi just said. He says, is Peter the rock? He says, well, in a sense, Peter's the rock because he's a derivative rock of Christ. But Augustine goes on to say that the church is not built on the person of Peter. It's not built on Peter as a man. He says the rock, in the very first section there, paragraph 1, it ends with, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. That is, upon myself, the Son of God, Christ is saying, I will build my church. I will build you, Peter, upon me, not me upon thee. So actually the Roman Catholic exegetes literally have this backwards from the mindset of St. Augustine, right? St. Augustine says that. Yeah. And then he goes on to say that what Ubi just said, that if we talk about the different apostles, he says they are all images of Peter. Peter is the image of the episcopate, and each bishop is a Peter, is what he goes on to say in paragraph 2 and 3. That's, again, sermon 26 of Augustine.
And it must be pointed out that this doctrine, this dogma of the papacy, is so fundamental, right, arguably as fundamental, if not more fundamental, than the teaching of baptismal regeneration or the Eucharist. So if we can't see a unanimous agreement that Matthew 16, the classic proof text, is Vatican I in all of the fathers, then it does not meet the bar of evidence.
Right. Chrysostom, too, has a whole homily on this section. It's homily 65 in the works of John Chrysostom. And you don't find anything about Vatican I here either. If you look at paragraphs 3, 4, 5, where he's actually exegeting the specific sections of Matthew 16, absolutely nothing about anything Vatican I. And by the way, again, if the Vatican I mindset was the mindset of the Church Fathers, where is it? Right, and when you ask that, well, here's an example of like an appeal. They'll say something like, well, Victor thought he could excommunicate the whole East, right?
Yeah, we will look at that.
Right, which we'll get to that. But I'm just I'm pointing out that just think about the way that the fathers are exegeting these passages, and just ask yourself, would a Roman Catholic Vatican I exegete do it the same way? And the answer is no. Because they actually develop a very specific, pretty creative hermeneutic for the various passages that we're going to go through here. But anyway, so there's two examples of no Vatican I mindset in Augustine or Chrysostom there.
I've got three more passages. I'm going to lump two of them together and then move on to the last one for brevity's sake.
So before you move on past Matthew 16, I'd like to add my take on that text. So in the Roman Catholic system, you have three aspects that go into what it is to be part of the episcopate. So you have the ability to remit and retain sins. You have the ability to offer the Eucharist. and you have the office of the keys and jurisdiction, right? So jurisdiction, Eucharist, remitting and retaining sins. That's the sort of the central aspects as to what every member of the Roman Catholic bishopric possesses. And what's interesting is that while Matthew 16 is Jesus honoring Peter for his first confession, right, of Jesus being the Son of God. Now, technically, you could argue actually that Nathanael in John 1 actually confesses Jesus to be the Messiah before Peter. But in this case, Peter is being given a kind of honor and a kind of privilege, I would argue, because of his boldness and because he's there to confess publicly first amongst the college of the apostles that Christ is the Son of God. And so this honor is given to Peter. However, 2 chapters later, right? Again, remember the Roman Catholic idea of what goes into being an episcopate, being a bishop. Jesus pronounces in Matthew 18 the very same thing to the college of the apostles. Now, he doesn't do this by saying, and I will give these keys to Peter, and then Peter will then give them to each of you, apostles. No, he pronounces it consistently to the entire group. In fact, he says, when 2 or 3 of you are gathered by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every word be established. And if anyone refuses to hear you, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to hear the church, let him be to you as a heathen and a tax collector. For assuredly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. If 2 or 3 of you are gathered in my name, there my Father is present with you, right? So Matthew 18:18, just 2 chapters after Matthew 16, literally the same thing is said to the whole college of the apostles. And it's not directly said to Peter. And we're going to see that same pattern when we look at the other biblical texts that are used. Sometimes something that's said to Peter is unique to Peter, specifically perhaps for the way he will die, for example. But that doesn't mean that it's excluding the rest of the college of the apostles, because the office of the keys, literally right here in Matthew 18:18, and by the way, they don't ever cite this text, do they? No, Roman Catholics will never cite Matthew 18:18 because it doesn't fit with the presuppositions about Matthew 16, you see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anything you'd like to add to that, Ubi, or?
No, I mean, you pretty much hit the nail on the head.
So the next 2 I'm going to put together. So the first one is from John 21, verse 15 to 19. Peter is entrusted with feeding the sheep. And so the Roman Catholic will argue that, well, Jesus is the shepherd. He leaves and goes to heaven. And then that means that Peter feeds the sheep. So Peter is the vicar of Christ. He's the vicar of the shepherd, and would retain all of his authority in feeding the sheep. And also Luke 22:32, Jesus prays for Peter's faith not to falter, which means that Peter's faith would be indefectible because God's prayers are always and eternally answered, or Jesus' prayers would be answered by the Father always, without fail. And this is an argument for papal infallibility and the indefectibility of the see. I'd like to hear your takes on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So here's what Saint John Chrysostom says about this. So he goes, what advantage, pray, could be greater than to be seen doing those things which Christ with own lips declared to proof of love to himself? For addressing the leader of the apostles, he said, Peter, do you love me? And when he confessed that he did, the Lord added, if you love me, tend my sheep. The master asked the disciple if he was loved by him, not in order to get information, but in order to teach us how great an interest he takes in the superintendence of these sheep. Now, St. John Chrysostom continues on, but he's trying to describe why he was afraid of being ordained, because he's talking about St. Peter as being the prototype of all bishops. Even then, even if St. Peter was only the Pope, I do not see how that would suddenly give him universal ordinary jurisdiction and infallibility. And that's really what it is. I mean, if they cannot prove infallibility and universal ordinary jurisdiction, well, all of Vatican I is wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I mean, it's the
yeah. Go ahead.
They'll try and squeeze this stuff in, like, oh, it says keys, okay, and that means, Well, it says rock. Okay, and that means what is it? Well, we all know that rock actually means infallible autocrats. It's like, well, no, we don't. I like, you've taken more than just a hop, skip, and a jump.
There's a kind of a creative eisegesis that is reading into the text the presuppositions, right? There's nothing in the text that tells you this. It's all based on centuries of kind of assumptions that that means Vatican I, right? Clearly, the keys means Vatican I. Then when you ask a Roman Catholic in their own theology what the office of the keys is, it's binding and loosing. Oh, well, in Matthew 18:18, Jesus said binding and loosing is something that they all possess in common. So in that regard, it's not unique to Peter, right? Oh, well, but Jesus said it first to Peter. Yeah, but how does that prove Vatican I? Because he said it first to Peter. How does this response of Jesus this is a response to Peter's 3 denials, right? So Peter denied Christ 3 times. This event here in John is Peter's redemption, right? Jesus is stressing to him, you denied me 3 times, and I'm going to ask you to reaffirm 3 times that you love me. Is Peter feeding the sheep? Absolutely. But how does feeding the sheep, or how does Peter's role, which by the way is essentially equal to Paul's role, like that's like saying, again, it's an assumption of the dogmas of Vatican I must be here in John's gospel, but you haven't proven that. You haven't shown that, because all this is a way to show that Peter has been redeemed and restored. And the same charge to feed the sheep is true of every one of the apostles. It's true of every bishop. So it's just ludicrous to take that, which is again just a healing of Peter's 3 denials, and somehow read into this grand God Emperor status.
And on the topic of Jesus praying for Peter's faith not to falter.
Yeah, I would say Peter.
I don't.
Go ahead, Ubi.
Well, I was just going to say that I don't see how that implies infallibility. I don't. I mean, the New Testament is filled with so many places where Saint Peter, he makes some major mistakes, and then there's that tradition of Quo Vadis, the persecution. Peter is fleeing the city of Rome. He encounters Jesus Christ. Jesus says to him, "Quo Vadis, where are you going?" And he goes, "Oh, I'm fleeing the persecution." Christ talks to him. He turns around. He goes back to the city. So, Christ can pray that Peter's faith will not fail, but that doesn't mean that it won't. We have plenty of examples of heretical popes. We have Vigilius. We have Honorius.
Honorius.
We have
Did Jesus' prayer fail when Honorius was condemned? This is ridiculous.
Well, here's a better one. Pope Saint Vitalian, who went through a period where he made communion with the Monothelites the official position of the Church of Rome. Saint Maximus the Confessor was martyred, I shouldn't say he wasn't martyred, he was a confessor, but he was mutilated because of Pope Saint Vitalian's decision.
Oh, wow.
The only reason Pope Saint Vitalian is saint is because later on he abandoned that as the official position of the Church of Rome.
I see. Right, and so you've had a few of these, the cases where popes have sort of been under duress. I think
Liberius,
yeah, and then they had to later sort of recant that position. Yeah, I would say too.
Right.
This kind of creative exegesis of these texts reminds me of the way that they treat Isaiah 22, which I think Sneck has pointed out accurately. This is only really after the schism, after even the Renaissance era, when you get into like the Jesuit creative usage of certain texts, which suddenly become new ways to prove the papacy, because the position of Eliakim in Isaiah 22, who was he's the steward of the keys, you could say he's the if you remember Lord of the Rings, like the steward of Gondor type of role. And
did you just make a Lord of the Rings analogy?
Yeah.
Okay, well, at least it wasn't Star Wars.
No. Well, because he's the steward, right? So Eliakim is likened to being a steward, and when Tolkien...
I actually liked Lord of the Rings quite a bit. It's much better than Star Wars.
Yeah, definitely. But Eliakim is said to be... Get this is great, because you'll see the creative sort of twist of usage here. this is a type of Christ, right? So in the phraseology here is repeated in Apocalypse 3:7 and is applied directly to the ascended Christ. But you'll notice when it says that Eliakim will be like a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, he will be like a father to the house of Judah. I will give him the key of the house of David, and I will lay upon his shoulder, so that he will open and no man will shut. He will shut and no man will open. I will fasten upon him a peg and a secure place, and he will become a glorious throne to his father's house. Eliakim is a type of Christ. In Apocalypse 3:7, this phraseology is applied to Jesus, who has the keys of David and the key of death and Hades, right? He opens and he shuts and no man closes, right? That's applied to Christ. Now, after the Renaissance period, Jesuits, they start to creatively utilize this text. Oh, that's actually about the power of Peter. It's the power of the Pope. And you'll actually see them start to go back to the Old Testament and rock symbolism. Oh, anything that's rock symbolism in the Old Testament suddenly starts to be appropriated for the papacy. Remember when I debated Nick Fuentes? He actually thought the text in the Apocalypse that where Jesus was speaking, he thought that was Peter speaking. I'm not trying to be mean to him, but I'm just saying, like, he was actually exemplifying the attitude of the creative Roman Catholic hermeneutics, which is ludicrous because
it's very Protestant.
Exactly.
I think that's a good point to make.
It's Protestant.
Well, there were
yes,
church.
Yeah.
Sorry. Continue.
No, I'm done.
There were a handful of church fathers who did give an exegesis of that section of Isaiah about it being about Peter. St. John Cassian and Ephrahat, the Persian sage, did, but they didn't. I mean, they didn't tie any infallibility or jurisdiction to it. They just, mention it almost in passing. There's, I think, like 5 or 6 quotations total I've seen from the whole first millennium on that topic, and it's just very in passing. Most of them were not very interested in it, and in fact, one of the recessions of the Septuagint, I can't remember, it phrases it differently in such a way that it is not so clear. And that was a recession of the Septuagint that was used by many of the church fathers.
Mm. Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and
I want to add too that, like, there's definitely just like the text in the Apocalypse. I mean, you can apply that to Peter and to the bishops, because I mean, my understanding is, like we said, the Peter is an image of all of the episcopi, right? He is sort of the archetype, right? And so they're all kind of utilizing that Petrine office. But the idea, again, that proves what is the later presupposition of Vatican I is what the Roman Catholic needs to demonstrate, and it's never demonstrated. It's just like the quote mine and then the creative exegesis.
The last text we're going to do on the biblical question is Acts 15. The Council of Jerusalem and the Roman Catholic will assert that Peter makes the decree at the Council of Jerusalem, and all of the apostles. This settles the matter. He stands up, he speaks, and the matter's settled. What would you say to that, Ubi?
The most horrendous, truly just cringe exegesis I've seen on that was from Catholic Bridge, where the guy attempts to go into Greek and make a big deal out of the aorist tense, and it becomes clear that he has absolutely no clue what the aorist is. It's just the simple past tense, with a few little nuances. But overall, they conciliarity. I mean, yes, St. James does give what appears to be the final verdict, but I don't think that he is doing that in terms of, I am the head bishop here. I think it's more that they all came to a conclusion together. Mm-hmm. And moreover, I saw, I believe it was Eric Ibarra in a debate with Craig Trulia say, when Craig brought up Acts 15, Eric said, oh, well, the whole episode and the whole decision was based on the life of St. Peter, so it still supports papal supremacy. But it actually is not. Mm-hmm. It's based on the Noahide laws, which Jews had for Gentile converts. That's what it is based on. It was something that was common to Judaism. All they were doing was rubber stamping.
How in the world was he getting the life of Peter as the basis for that? I mean, it's clearly the Noahic covenant.
The vision. It's the vision of St. Peter where he sees the blank come down. But even before that, I mean, I applaud Mr. Ibarra there for connecting two stories, but even before that, Christ says it's not what comes out of a man that defiles him. Or sorry, it's not what goes into a man that defiles him, but what comes out, right? And in so doing, sets the stage for a more or less denial of the kasher laws.
It's pertinent to note also that the fathers consistently, as far as I'm aware, will say that St. James is the one presiding at the Council of Jerusalem.
Right, that's what I was going to say. I mean, yeah, he's the presiding bishop, and they all get quiet, and James speaks, right? So imagine if they had all gotten quiet and Peter spoke. Imagine the creative exegesis and dogmatic proofs that text would be used. I mean, imagine them using that, right? They would be like, "Oh, let's see, it proves that everybody got quiet." But no, it's not everybody getting quiet and Peter speaking. It's everybody getting quiet and James speaking. And so we can see there that the way we're going to read these texts is based.
Well, I believe, let's say I'd have to relook at it. It would be, I believe they do get quiet after Peter speaks. I'd have to look at it again, Mike.
No, but, I'm looking at it right now. I'm looking at verse.
Either way,
verse 13. It says, "After they became silent, James answered, 'Men and brethren, listen to me. Peter has declared how God spoke to the Gentiles to call out a people for his own name. And then with these, the prophets agree.'" So they actually cite the text. They look at the revelation that Peter had. They cite the scriptural text. And then they go to the Noahic covenant from Genesis 9, 1-6. And we know this is the Noahic covenant because it talks about abstaining from things strangled with blood and that have the blood in them still. That's directly from the Noahic covenant. And so that's the end of the debate is James talking and saying what the revelation to Peter is, what the revelation to the rest of the apostles is, and what the Old Testament and the Noahic covenant say. And then they write the letter.
Yes. Oh, it says verse 12 here. Then all the multitude kept silent and gave audience to Barnabas and Paul. I think what happens is people just, they go, oh, they kept silent. It's like, well, yeah, that's polite. I mean, that's standard protocol when you're listening to a speaker. I mean, what do you expect they would do? Like, oh, it's not Peter speaking. Throw tomatoes at him. Like, no. I mean, keep chattering on. Keep chattering on about what your neighbor is doing, how they don't spin wool correctly, and they smell like goats. I don't know. I mean, you'd stay quiet.
Well, and again,
when anyone important speaks.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the approach here is seeing what everybody's take is, right? So it's everybody's ideas. It's synodal. It's conciliar. And then it ends, and if you look at verse 18 and 19, it's James who says, "Therefore I judge that we should not trouble the Gentiles." Again, because he's saying that what I'm saying is in harmony with what Peter said. Peter has already spoken, and then James speaks. And so we see that there's a commonality here. There's a discovery of what is the common revelation to all the apostles that's consistent with the Old Testament.
Yes. And even if this were an example of universal ordinary jurisdiction or infallibility, and that Peter just spoke and they all sort of like, oh, well, okay, what would be the point of St. James saying, well, I judge? Because I have seen it argued that St. James was only speaking for the Jews, the Jewish Christians. But if St. Peter if he is infallible, it's not like, well, that papal declaration, it didn't apply to me because I'm Jewish. I got to wait for my guy to speak. Well, no, I mean,
it's superfluous.
It's like, why would his judgment at the end matter? His judgment would be universal to them.
Are we all good on that then? I think we can move on to papal quote mines. I think it's important to first of all point out that a lot of Roman Catholics, when they will debate you online, they will endlessly spam quotes. And what will they quote from? They will say they're quoting from the Patrologia Graeca or the Patrologia Latina, but as far as I'm aware, they're both quite messy. I'm just going to throw some ideas out and then you can talk about it. The PG and the PL are messy. I don't believe they can read the quotes that they're quoting. I believe that quote mining is the way Roman Catholics quote mine the fathers is the same way a Protestant quote mines scripture. Mm-hmm. And I would just like to hear your thoughts on that, and then we can talk about how to deal with the quote mines when you come across them. We're going to teach you. We're going to give you a book recommendation, and we're going not to teach you. We're not going to give you a fish. We're going to teach you how to fish. We're going to give you a fishing rod. You'll see. So go ahead, Ubi.
So on the Patrologia, yeah, it is difficult to read, and there are a lot of typos in it because of not only copyist errors, but when it was printed out, it was not. It's not like they looked at this on a computer screen. They individually put letters. They would print 1 page or 2 pages. They would have an editor look at it, and then he would okay it or not. And if your Latin or your Greek were really, really good, chances are you were not stuck as a proofreader for a press. You were probably teaching at a university or, translating documents. But what I find, and you see this in so many of these articles, is they will quote directly from the Patrologia. They'll say, Minia, this or that, whatever, Patrologia Graeca, Patrologia Latina, or Mansi, or whatever, right? And based on the intelligence of that person, that there is no way they found that quote on their own. They got it out of a quote mine. They got it out of secondary sources. And they are trying to pass it off as though they found it on their own. And that's a form of plagiarism, right? You have to say where you found the quotation. You have to say where you found the citation.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time this is just like lifted from Catholic Answers or Stephen Ray's book or Scott Hahn's book, or this is very rare that this is actually anybody who literally is reading the Greek and the Latin. Hardly ever.
Mm-hmm. And if you are educated enough to read the Greek and the Latin, chances are you would not be arguing for a lot of the stuff that pop apologists argue for.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, because you would know the difficulty and the nuance. You can't just throw these quotes out of context.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So here is the book that we're going to recommend to you. This is like kind of the anti-quote mine. This is the antidote to. I'm not saying it's a perfect book or that it's completely deals with everything. It's sufficient for someone who isn't going to delve deep into the intricacies of the language as Ubi Petrus does. But if Jay can pull it out, we can show you it.
Yeah, I've got it. Yeah.
And it's called Papalism. It's by Edward Denny. And this is like the kind of go-to book. So if you could turn to the glossary, we can show you how to use it, because a lot of people misuse this book. It gets recommended to them, they purchase it, and then they try to read it cover to cover, which is a big error because you're just going to get bored. It's about 1,000 plus pages tome, and you're going to get very bored if you read it cover to cover. So the way you would use it is you go to the glossary, and let's say someone quotes, Pope St. Leo's tome, for example, as an example of papal claim. You'd go to the glossary, you would go to the, Pope Leo, where it says Pope Leo, and then there would be headings saying what about Pope Leo would be the argument, and then there'll be a number, and that number is the number of the paragraph. It's not the number of the page, okay? It's the number of the paragraph. And then you'll go to that paragraph and you'll read the relevant section. So you use it as a referent, and it will thoroughly deal with, and then you can read further. Some of the citations can be a little bit complicated at the bottom if you want to look into the citations that are there. So there will be certain things like EP dot, which is epistola, which means letter, cap dot, which is capitula, which is chapter, a capitulum, sorry. ibid, IBID, means just the previous source. Et sec, et space seq, means and what comes after. And vide supra means see above. So if he's referring to something that's previous. So that's just if there's anything you want to add to that, Ubi?
I'd say it's a pretty good book. I came across it fairly recently on the recommendation of a friend, and it can be dry reading at points. I thought parts of it were not very good, but for the most part, it was very good. And what is interesting is how now in the Catholic Church, with things like the Chieti document, it more so aligns with what papalism is actually teaching, right? That the reality was more this than that.
Wait, what aligns? You mean you're saying Denny's thesis in papalism is more consistent with like post Vatican II admissions about?
Yes.
Okay, I got you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I would.
Ubi, could you make a point about how the scholarship of the pro satis cognitum view, non-development doctrine view, scholars such as Chapman and Rivington and Giles, could you explain? Could you talk a bit about that? Because this book responds to that. Is that correct?
More or less. Well, the book was written in response to satis cognitum, but I mean, all of those satis cognitum is basically just an official summary of all of these, low-level quote mines. When Anglicans converted in England in the 1800s, a lot of them became fairly famous as Catholic apologists and priests, such as Fortescue or Chapman, or I'm trying to think of the other one. Giles, as far as I know, stayed in Anglican. But the problem with a quote mine is that you are not really getting the full story. You are getting what someone wants you to see. And so it really is important to sit down and actually put in the effort to try and learn at least one classical language so that you can understand what is going on. Because absolutely no translation is unbiased. And especially with a language like Latin, where there's such variance in what a word means in various situations, you really need to be able to see for yourself what it says. Now, that being said, something like that book Papalism, it does a pretty good job of addressing quote mines, even though it is itself more or less a quote mine. It's sort of an
anti-quote mine, right? Quote mine, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's if a quote mine steps on it, it blows up. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anything you'd like to add, Jay?
Well, I would say that's better than like I remember back in the day when I would kind of be going back before I converted to Roman Catholicism. Like I have all the works of William Webster, and I went through all of those, and he kind of does this same thing where it's like, well, you've got all these quotes, but let me show you a whole bunch of quotes, and it turns into this kind of like Protestant back and forth thing with the Roman Catholic, right? And I would say that what I've noticed in Gate and Denny, even though they're kind of dated, is that you get a better story of what's going on here. So this is actually a better approach than the William Webster Protestant back and forth just snippet thing, because Webster is not scholarly enough to even know, again, the context of the issues to the same degree that Denny illustrates in his book. So that's something that duped me when I was a Roman Catholic. I was actually duped by a lot of these kind of quote mine things. I thought, well, if you've got Irenaeus saying that you got to be in communion with the first see, well, there you go. But I didn't even pay attention to the fact that that's almost always truncated. So when I actually read Against Heresies, I noticed that there's a lot of other things that are said by Irenaeus that the Roman Church now doesn't even accept, right? Like the reasons that he says that Rome is important because it's doubly apostolic, right? It doesn't mention a special infallible, anything like that, anything like what's in Vatican I. So you don't get the full picture of the Irenaeus quote. I know that's going to come up here in a little bit, but when I was Roman Catholic, I was just kind of duped by a lot of these things because I just read, these pop Roman Catholic apologists, and I was like, oh, well, there you go, right? It's that clear, right? It's that easy, yeah. There's nothing more to it, like open and shut case, right?
Right, and you're getting such a small sliver of the total literature that when you read a quote mine, you really do think, wow, they are always talking about St. Peter. Yeah. When you actually read through an author, well, you might only get one quotation from them on St. Peter. As a note, I forgot, there are quite a few Anglicans who converted to Catholicism. Cardinal Newman, or Newman was one of them who became Cardinal Newman. Yeah. Rivington, Allies. And I don't know if Allies entered the Catholic clergy, but I know that the other ones did. And they became very vocal voices. Newman, by far the most reasonable of them, or the most scholarly of them. But a lot of them just had that convert fervor that made them say really odd things. I don't know what else to say. I mean, I'm a convert. We're all converts here, but perhaps I'm just not that fervent. I've had a priest tell me, he goes, you need to be more fervent. I said, I'm too lazy.
Lewis, do you have more? Do you have more of these examples?
Of what exactly?
I thought you were gonna take us through the misused ones, like the popular misuse.
Yes, yeah, we're going to go through those in a second. I thought we would just segue for a second and talk about because papalism on its own is all well and good for doing general apologetics, but there are individuals, and the only one I'm aware of that would actually respond to you if you brought out an argument from Denny's papalism would be someone like Eric Ibarra. I actually don't know any modern Roman Catholic apologist who will actually try to respond to any counter arguments to the quote mines other than Ibarra. So when someone like Ibarra responds, what we are doing at Ubi Petrus is writing articles to respond to the response, or to holistically refute the whole argument. So could Ubi maybe talk about the articles, why they're being written, and why it is actually important that they are written?
For the most part, I am more into the history of the church. So that is why the focus of the articles is heavily geared towards history, right? But I recall coming across Mr. Ibarra's articles about a year ago, perhaps a year and a half ago, when a friend emailed one to me and asked me what I thought of it. And the answer was, I thought this guy's historically and theologically illiterate. And so I broke one down for this friend. He goes, wow, that's great. Can I send you some more of these? And I said, yes. And I started reading them. And then he put me in touch with a few more friends of his who were very troubled by things that Ibarra says. And I started to get this picture of Mr. Ibarra, of his thought process. And it's very strange, in my opinion, his whole thought process. I don't really know how to describe it, but he definitely, as far as I can see, he is very concerned with trying to get Anglicans and Eastern Orthodox to convert to this sort of fantasy Catholicism. It's not real Catholicism per se. A lot of it is just, a lot of what he says is just, bad theology. Like, you can just disobey a pope. You can just, what that pope said was heretical based on my own private judgment of what this document written 300 years ago said from a previous pope. So it's like, well, okay, what is the point of having a pope then? So I began writing articles, and hopefully they do some good. And if they don't, at least I'm entertained.
What do you think is now? So Eric is kind of getting the reputation of being a leading online or Roman Catholic apologist. What do you think is the biggest problem, other than the sort of illiteracy when it comes to the theological issues? I mean, in my personal experience, I used to argue with Eric, over the past 3 years, mainly over theological issues: the essence energy distinction, filioque, energetic manifestation. We would go back and forth. And I noticed that you could really make you seemingly you would make progress, and then the next day it was like you never even had that discussion. What do you think the biggest flaw in his apologetic is? That divide between like the Catholicism in my mind, where I have a trad Catholicism that I think Catholicism is that doesn't match up to the real world, or is it his historical errors, or what's the biggest problem with the whole Ibarra approach?
What I pick up on right away is the historical illiteracy.
Okay.
That's what I pick up on. But the reason why people turn to this guy is that he spends a lot of time trying to build up himself, build up his own credibility in lieu of actual argument. So he comes out, he presents all these quotations that he's taken from other books, oftentimes without citing them. And he just says, well, it comes from Mansi, it comes from Migne, it comes from whatever collection, without saying that he got this out of a quote mine. Sort of prancing about as someone important, thinks he can get people to listen to him. And I don't know if he does this out of insecurity about his own Catholicism. Personally, I do not think that he is insecure in Catholicism. I think that he's a very convinced Roman Catholic, and he is probably a very full Roman Catholic to his abilities. But I do not think that he accurately represents history or theology of either group. And I think that he is very afraid of what is happening in the Catholic Church now.
Right.
And does not quite understand why it is happening, and perhaps trying to get people to convert to bolster his own insecurities about the state of the Catholic Church.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, I never thought about that like if you could kind of convince people, then it's maybe that functions like a kind of salve to your own doubts and inner worries about, after Pachamama, I can't imagine any of the trads not having some doubts if they're honest with themselves.
Right. And I mean, when I was, I not from birth, but shortly after birth, when I was baptized until about age 20, I was Roman Catholic. And you start to realize, things are really falling apart. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How is this happening? And so I can understand where he is coming from, but I think that he has a very... I think my opinion is that his ego is just way too involved in it.
So what about Lewis? Where do you want to take us now? Did you want to get into the specifics of Ibarra, or do we have more of the misused quotes?
What would you prefer? We have a fair amount of time, so what was the first option? Sorry, there was the specifics of the quotes and
the issues with Ibarra.
Why don't we talk a bit more about Ibarra after we've done some of these quote mines?
Yeah, Go ahead. What's the next one?
All right. So we're going to do 3 popularly cited. These are probably some of the most popular. So the first one is the one that Dr. Taylor Marshall uses in his stream with Flanders. He says, so you see, as early as the 3rd century, 2nd, 3rd centuries, we have Pope Saint Victor, who threatens to excommunicate all of Asia Minor over the date of Easter. How based of him. Now, what are the issues with this? This is a very small part of the entire picture, is it not, Ubi?
It is. It is a very small part of the picture, and you regularly had bishops and, well, synods, really. Okay, so the story goes, we only know about this from Eusebius's history.
The same stream key, so hopefully this will work. Okay, I think we're back. We should be back if you can see me. It looks like the stream didn't end. And we should be getting... yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I know you guys can. Yeah, sorry about that. So I was so engrossed in Ubi and Lewis's soothing voices coming through these microphones that I was in a trance. I didn't even realize that the battery was dying and the laptop was unplugged. So sorry about that. We're back. Pope Victor, refresh us here.
Yeah, let me reinstate the train of thought Ubi had. So Pope Victor asks synods to issue their understanding of the tradition, and then he endeavors to excommunicate Asia Minor.
Yeah, so he does this, and first he's criticized by Saint Irenaeus, this saint who supposedly said that you always have to agree with Rome. Right?
Good point. Yeah.
Right, Saint Irenaeus goes, you really shouldn't do that. Second, we know that synods of bishops were regularly issuing depositions towards other synods and other individuals. We know that this was fairly standard. A very famous example of this would be Dioscorus of Alexandria at the Council of Ephesus, the Second Council in 449. He issues a series of depositions against Domnus of Antioch, Theodoret, Flavian, and other bishops who did not agree with him. And the depositions were considered valid enough that Chalcedon feels the need to canonically reverse them. We know that St. Cyril of Alexandria, telling the story about John of Antioch coming to the Council of Ephesus, he states that many of the bishops of John of Antioch had been deposed from their sees. Okay, well, who deposed them? If John of Antioch, their patriarch, deposed them, why would he bring them to a council? It had to be someone outside Antioch that did it. We know, for example, that what was it during the Origin of Alexandria, long after he had left Alexandria, when he was actually ordained by someone else, and this is in the 200s, when he was ordained outside Egypt, he was deposed by an Egyptian synod. It was nothing new. I mean, there are a bunch of examples of this in an article that we did on St. Cyril. It's fairly standard.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'd just like to add to that, just a little bit more background as I've understood it and read it, is that in about 157 AD, the Pope spoke to St. Polycarp. So St. Polycarp came to Rome to talk to the Pope about the differences on the day of Easter. And St. Irenaeus basically says that despite the disagreement, they still maintain communion. Now, note that this refutes the true Orthodox because they schism over the calendar. But apparently there's no need for schism over the day of Easter. Mm-hmm. So how's that? Then the following two popes essentially required the Orientals to celebrate Easter, but on their date, but only in the local churches where that date was so, because before they were celebrating it on 14th Nisan, despite the local churches say they were leaving Asia Minor, local churches were celebrating it on the other way it was being celebrated. And I think there's there's a good point, is that despite the excommunication threat, so before the actual excommunication is made, there's a threat made. Bishop Polycrates of Ephesus states that those above him, i.e. the apostles, from whom they received the tradition, it was supposedly the Apostle John. Huh? Oh, I can hear myself, sorry. Those above him say that, quote, we ought to obey God rather than man, unquote. So Bishop Polycrates is responding to the Pope saying, well, the apostles gave us this tradition, so we obey God, we don't obey man. And even after Pope Victor excommunicated the Asia Minor churches, the other bishops didn't follow his lead. They rebuked him. Now, when the Pope excommunicates someone today, they're out of the church. It doesn't matter what the local churches in the Roman Catholic Church say. So the last point would just be to make that the action of excommunication actually was preceded by synodal decisions, synodal conclusions. So this isn't an exercise of immediate jurisdiction as well, even if it were an extraordinary instance. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I would say that sounds good.
Okay. So anything you want to add, Jay? Or
no, it's just if you have the Gate book, he says a lot of the same stuff. He's really good. Pages 58, 59, 60. He covers the fact that it really doesn't work then to turn around and use Irenaeus as a proof of papal infallibility.
We're about to move on to Saint Irenaeus now.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is a quote from
I'm
Saint Irenaeus.
saying that the Victor incident doesn't work because.
Right.
Go ahead.
All right. No. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No,
sorry.
I'm just pointing out that Gate makes that point very well, and talks about how you'll find them, Polycarp and Irenaeus, writing in the same kind of way with the same level of authority as the other bishops and the Bishop of Rome. So even though he's saying there's a requirement to be in unity, and because of the preeminence of Rome, the reason that he gives that Rome is preeminent is actually later condemned as a basis for Rome's preeminence. Like, you can't say that the preeminence is Peter and Paul, according to the Roman Catholic dogma. Do you understand? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's in Denzinger, isn't it? As far as I'm aware.
Yeah. So they're essentially condemning the view that Irenaeus had for the reason that Rome has primacy, which is ironic because he's supposed to be the proof of Roman primacy. One of them.
And as we're going to move on to St. Irenaeus, this quote that we're giving you from St. Irenaeus, that is a very popular one for papal infallibility, is the only quote they can muster from St. Irenaeus, by the way. So this is the quote from this is the proof text from St. Irenaeus. It's the only one. So the quote goes, it's from Against Heresies, and it says, quote, since, however, it would be very tedious in such a volume as this to reckon up the succession of all the churches, we do put to confusion all those who, in whatever manner, whether by an evil self-pleasing, by vainglory, or by blindness and perverse opinion, assemble in unauthorized meetings. We do this, I say, by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, the very ancient and universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, as also by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the successions of the bishops. And this is the clincher according to the Roman Catholic, quote, for it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority, unquote. Now, there's a lot of, as I understand, we really have to go into the Latin here. So, Ubi, take it away.
Yeah, the issue is, okay, so the Latin word convenire, yeah, it does, it can mean to agree with, it can mean to come together. It's where we get the word convenient, right? It's something that's easy because it all comes together at one point. It's agreeable. But there's really no consensus on what Saint Irenaeus meant in this situation, because the form of the verb that he uses is convenire ad. Well, convenire ad means to resort to. There's no other translation for it. So it is not clear what he is trying to say exactly. And I have seen some really, and I mean really, tortured attempts at trying to make sense of it. And I don't find any of them convincing. All I do know is that the Latin is unclear.
Could you talk a little bit about the concept of the princeps?
Oh, it means preeminent, sort of like preeminent jurisdiction, you could say.
I think a good point is that the reason why St. Irenaeus mentions Rome is because he says it would take too long to enumerate all the successions of the churches. So he's refuting the Gnostics, and he's citing antiquity and universality to prove the authority of tradition, so that refutes the Protestants anyway. And he says that it would be too long to give a succession of all the churches. So he chooses Rome as an example out of convenience, really, in his argument, I would say.
Right.
And it seems that from the Roman Catholic view, he's kind of enforcing a moral obligation to agree with the church. But this would be kind of superfluous, since his whole argument is based around all the sees that he doesn't enumerate having the same faith based on tradition and antiquity and universality.
Well, and we know Rome had the honor of spotless orthodoxy for a long time, so it would make perfect sense that he would do that. And in fact, he seems to stress it's the faith of the Roman Church that we're talking about here, because he says that the tradition that's derived from the apostles. So if you read all of Book 3, he's pretty consistently talking about a specific tradition. If you look over into chapter 4, section 2, when he continues to talk about the apostolic doctrine, the apostolic tradition, it's for him, it's scripture and tradition, right? So it doesn't really have anything to do with a special preeminence to just the successors in Rome. So he's pointing out apostolic succession, and he's going to argue throughout the whole book that the church is built on scriptures, tradition, apostolic succession, and the sacraments, right? So these are sort of a three-tiered stool of the church, you could say, the three legs of the stool. So, and that's why he'll talk about Polycarp, and Polycarp passing on tradition to his successors, and he finds it, as you said, most convenient to cite the Roman Church, because the Roman Church was known, as you said, for spotless orthodoxy. But the actual thing that's being passed down here, that's being confessed, is the faith. He says that the faith that's preached from them, right? So there's a need to hold to the faith that is preached by the most obvious example of a doubly apostolic church, right? Rome, Peter and Paul. There's no way that both Peter and Paul are going to be teaching false doctrine, right? So they're going to have a true doctrine. And so he's saying we need to adhere to the faith of the Church of Rome, because the Church of Rome had an Orthodox faith. And you'll see the same type of argument used by St. Maximus, right? He'll use that same type of argumentation. But that is not the same thing as a promise of total infallibility, total jurisdiction by the very actions of Irenaeus himself. We know that.
And the section that the Roman Catholics translate as "every church must agree with the Church of Rome" is, as Ubi says, can be translated as to resort to. Now, in Edward Denny's book Papalism, he explains this as being like an actual convening of the peoples to the See of Rome itself, like a physical journey, as I understand it. And he uses a parallel in St. Gregory of Nazianzen, who in his orations, and this is retrieved from Denny's book, and St. Gregory says, quote, this is about Constantinople. He says, quote, "The eye of the world, i.e. Constantinople, the bond between East and West, to which the extremities of the earth resort from all quarters, and from which they start afresh as from a common emporium of the faith, unquote. So because St. Irenaeus is refuting the Gnostics, he's basically saying, well, let's prove it. Let's bring people, all the churches, all the bishops come to the Church of Rome because it's the capital of the empire. And all the bishops and all the faithful come to the Church of Rome, and we'll look at our traditions and we'll see who has the wrong tradition based on the apostolic succession. Would you like to correct me on anything, Ubi, or have I got that right?
I'm not really convinced by any of the arguments about, well, it actually means, that you have to show up there, this or that. I think that it is just one of these statements that is vague. It does not mean anything about agreeing with it. It's just a statement that it's lost in translation permanently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think one good point there would be to make that if St. Irenaeus was having an issue with the Gnostics, why didn't he just appeal to the Pope directly to make an infallible statement to deal with them?
Right, but I mean, I'm not an expert in Latin, right? I'm really I'm a simple person, right? I'm one of the little people, and I know that there is a tremendous debate among scholars of Latin about what is actually meant. And I know that as of the last 100 or so years, slowly you have seen even Roman Catholic translations switch more towards resort to.
Yeah.
As opposed to agree with.
Anything else on St. Irenaeus? Nope. Okay.
Well, I would just say
Jay,
that there's no mention of the Vatican I idea here, and so in other words, you're going to read Irenaeus here as you can read it in an Orthodox way, or you can read it in a traditional Roman Catholic way, from your presupposition. I'm not saying the Roman Catholic position is true. I'm saying that Orthodox can read this in the exact same way and come away with it being Orthodox, and then because again, Rome is Orthodox in this period, right? Or you can come away with this, presuming the Vatican I view. But I don't think that either one of those is definitive because, like I said, even Goethe, even in his day, he talked about how there were differing translations of this text. So this has been known and debated for a long time, which the Latin, that's way out of my purview. I don't know Latin, so I can't comment on that. But just the text itself is problematic from the Vatican I view. Because the importance that's attached here is not on the basis of any divine prerogatives, but it's on the basis of being doubly apostolic. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It would be good to find that section in Denzinger if I could. If anybody in the chat knows, there's a specific statement. I think it's in Vatican I or it's in Satis Cognitum, I think. But it specifically rejects the idea that the importance and power and supremacy of the Bishop of Rome has anything to do with Paul at all. Do you know what I'm talking about? There's a specific rejection.
Yeah, I know which one you're talking about. I might try and find it as we move on here.
Anyway,
so the third one we wanted to look at was Saint Cyprian or Saint Cyprian, and the quote goes like this. This is the one I've chosen. Quote: "With a false bishop appointed for themselves by heretics, they dare even to set sail and carry letters from schismatics and blasphemers to the chair of Peter and the principal church, in which sacerdotal unity has its source. Nor did they take thought that these are Romans, whose faith was praised by the preaching apostle, and among whom it is not possible for perfidy to have entrance." Would you like to explain sacerdotal unity, Ubi?
Well, the See of Rome was very large and very important, and because of that, they were a source of unity in the sense that if you were going from, say, North Africa to Gaul, the Church of Rome knew who the bishops were in northern Italy and Gaul, and it also knew who they were in, say, North Africa. In North Africa, you might not know who the bishops were in Gaul, although St. Cyprian does write a letter to Pope St. Stephen about this, about a bishop in Gaul later. But example being Rome and other large churches kept lists of the bishops they were in communion with. Furthermore, and back to St. Cyprian's idea about all bishops being, well, not his idea, but he utilizes it, about all bishops being Peter. If the body of St. Peter is in Rome, that is where St. Peter resides. His relics are laid to rest there. And so St. Peter, being the source of sacerdotal unity, well, he's in Rome. It's where it springs from his relics, which are in Rome. But there is a point that is made. He talks about to the chair of Peter and to the principal church. He talks about them as if they're two separate categories. If the chair of Peter was the principal church, he would not be putting "and" in between those. He would be saying it is the chair of Peter, the principal church. Instead, it's like saying, this is Jay Dyer. He is a podcaster and a film critic, right? Well, those are not the same thing. You wouldn't say Jay is a podcaster, a film critic. Well, what do you mean? It doesn't quite make sense without the "and" there because they're separate categories. Rome is the see of Peter par excellence, but the chair of Peter is the bishop's chair. And the reason why St. Cyprian ends up spending so much time mentioning Rome is because the schism of Novatian, it starts in Rome. It is centered there because Novatian was an anti-pope.
Right. Good point. Yeah.
I found the citation from Denzinger. It's Denzinger 1091, by the way. And go ahead.
Can you read it, what it says, or is it long?
No, it's not that long. Error of the dual head of the church, Innocent X, from the Decree of the Sacred Office, 1647. The Most Holy, ellipses, has decreed and declared heretical this proposition so presented that it established an exact equality between St. Peter and St. Paul without subordination and subjection of St. Paul to St. Peter in supreme power and in the rule of the universal church. St. Peter and St. Paul are the two princes of the church who form one head, or there are two Catholic heads and supreme leaders of the Catholic Church, joined in highest unity between themselves, or the head of the Catholic Church consists of two who are most divinely united into one, or there are two supreme pastors and guardians of the Church who form one head only. Those are all condemned propositions.
And I got my Denzinger out. It was Denzinger what?
1091.
1091, okay. Sorry, go ahead.
I don't have anything in particular to talk about. Saint Cyprian. Maybe I could either bring up another quote or Ubi could talk about why Saint Cyprian is kind of really an awful father to cite for the papal case in terms of how he behaved in Africa.
He disagreed with Stephen famously on the issue of baptism. Guttay has, just summarizing Guttay, he points out that Rome's honor is one of a juridical or unitive focus. It is not mentioned to be divine right or necessarily infallible. The charism is not ever mentioned to be a perpetuity. He disagreed with Stephen. There's no automatic acceptance of Rome in the mindset of St. Cyprian. And then later on, Jerusalem is mentioned as the mother and model church, which is an interesting point. The actions of the Bishop of Rome, according to St. Cyprian, are not viewed as universally binding. The Petrine office of Peter is, according to St. Cyprian, literally held by all the bishop. They all have the, quote, same honor and same authority, which is a direct quote from him. Constantine called Jerusalem the mother church. The church rejects Rome's pretensions in this matter. So, yeah, I think that's how I would respond to it. But
you have something else as well. Saint Cyprian calls. It's oftentimes alleged that he called Rome the root or the radix in Latin, but in letter 72. in which he's writing to another bishop and describing. It was written right before he was excommunicated by Stephen. In talking about why he clings to rebaptism, he says, for those of us who cling to the root. Well, he's in staunch disagreement with the root, apparently, if the root is the Pope. So how is he clinging to what he's in staunch disagreement with? That's in letter 72.
Okay, excellent. That's a good point. Yeah, you'll find that when you start to really think out the implications of this and put it in the context, that a lot of these usages don't even make sense with the rest of the lives of these people or the rest of the writings of these people. Like they directly contradict themselves. And so,
especially considering Saint Cyprian died out of communion with Rome.
Good point. Yeah.
There is no evidence that he came back into communion with Rome. None.
What's the next quote?
We can do another Saint Cyprian one. I only had 3 written down.
Okay.
I could just pull one up, maybe. I don't know. I prepared for those 3, but if Ubi thinks he can do one on the fly.
What about that later council that Ibarra had mentioned? Is that in our notes?
The Synod of 861.
Yeah.
So the one where Ibarra makes the argument that the papal legates come and intervene in the Council of 861 without an appeal.
Yeah.
And the Eastern bishops seem to have no problem with that. Ubi, do you feel like you've kind of revised this in your head enough to talk about it?
Review. Well, you could say that. I'm really inarticulate, and when I get caught on the, like, what do you think about this? I kind of like, what? If I recall correctly, there was no appeal. There was an alleged appeal, but the bishops did not come and say, we are going to judge. What they did was they came and they asked if they could review the case. And St. Photius and the emperor, not wanting a problem, because they could have said no, just said, yeah, sure. Because their goal at that time was to get St. Photius, his situation smoothed out with Rome. And telling the legates no, take a hike, would have inflamed the situation. So saying, yes, you are free to review the case, was the peaceable way.
It's dealt with. It's dealt with by Denny on page 463. If people are interested in that, they can go to that. But go ahead.
Oh, that was all I had to say. I know a lot of the times it is argued that there was an appeal, and I would have to go look that up off the top of my head. Yeah,
we'll have we'll maybe have an article about that at some point.
Okay.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe if we've gotten quite a few requests as of late for articles on Saint Photius.
Do you want me to? Maybe I'll just do. Maybe I can do one. Why don't we talk about the Tome of Leo? So that's just something we've written about. Ubi's written about. So, sorry, I say we because I feel like whenever I edit the articles, yes. So the Roman Catholic will argue that Pope Leo essentially decreed an ex cathedra to Chalcedon in his tome, and it was submitted to. As an ex cathedra would be submitted to.
Now let's stress
that
too
correct,
that Ibarra hung a lot on this claim, by the way.
He did. Well, it's in the so at the First Vatican Council, there's a relatio, the official interpretation of Pastor Eternus, and it cites 3 examples, and it has been a while since I read this, but it cites 3 examples of papal infallibility in the past. And I believe, and do not quote me on this, all three of those examples came from the second millennium, not the first. And the Catholic Church does not recognize the tome as ex cathedra. Now, when I wrote the initial article, Ibarra, he understood it as ex cathedra. He then tried to deny that, and I had a screenshot of him saying that it was, and I included that in the rejoinder. So he tried to back out of it. But no, the tome itself, I mean, you can read the articles, the exchange. They're much more detailed, and in speech, I'm very...
yeah, I have by the way, everybody, I have Ubi's blog linked below. So when you're watching this in the future, the link is down there. You can see there's multiple articles, so it's sort of dealing one by one with different claims from Ibarra. But go ahead.
Oh, I'm very inarticulate in speech, so I prefer to write, because it takes me a while for thoughts to come to me. Mm-hmm. My mother said I was stupid. The teacher said, maybe just a little slow, but, it takes me a while.
No, that's fine.
So shall we talk about, so we go back to what we were talking about and talk about Ibarra and refusing debates and setting up multiple hoops to have to jump through to be able to debate?
It's like re-describing the train wreck. Okay, so first I'll explain. I don't want to focus too much on Eric, because I think he's kind of boring. But initially, what happened when I was sent all of these, nothing. I'm sure in other ways he's very interesting. I just don't think his thought process is that interesting. But when I initially came across him, I went into his Facebook group. I reactivated an old Facebook account. I went in and I read all of the threads for a couple of months and started to get an idea of what he was like and what his thought process was, right? So by the time I went to write this first article, I had a pretty good picture of what he would do. And so far, he's walked he's walked the path exactly like I thought he would in every single way. He's very predictable in that sense. Mm-hmm. Now, he challenged me to a debate, but earlier than that, well, no, I should say, no. He challenged me to a debate. He said that he would not write. Oh, geez, I'm trying to remember now. I think he said he would not respond in writing. He wanted to do it on his show with Michael Lofton. And I said, if you want me to come on that show, you have to pay me. And they balked at that because I said I would be providing content for your show, which I'm sure you're making money off of, or at least attempting to. And to prepare for a discussion or a debate, he wanted a debate, I believe. It would take me a certain amount of time. So I told him he could pay me 500 quid an hour. And Lofton got very sensitive and banned me from the show right then and there. So I have the dubious honor of being banned from that show moments after being invited to that show. In fact, Lofton actually invited everyone on that thread onto their show.
Right.
And I had suspected for a while they were desperate for guests, because under my YouTube account, which is under a different name, it's kind of a silly name, I made a comment on one of their videos. And instead of answering the question that I had, someone named Reason and Theology, and I did not realize this was Michael Lofton at the time. It turns out it is. Inviting me onto their show. And I said, well, no, thank you, but would you be able to answer the question? And then the response was, well, it would be easier to discuss this on the show. And you get that sort of needy feeling, that kind of creepy, needy feeling. And then Eric chimes in a day or two later, oh, talk on the show about this or that. And then a few days later, I get this other thing, I believe from Lofton, saying, this would really be great. We'd like to schedule it. Finally, I just deleted my comment. But, I didn't want more updates, more invites. But between that event and then Ibarra and Lofton on Facebook inviting me, I think I've been invited onto that show 14 or 15 times. Which tells me they're desperate for
But
this.
why? So you've been invited on, but you're banned. I'm confused.
Well, what happened was after I was banned, Eric, I don't know if he did not realize I was banned or if he just thought like, oh, he just wanted to like challenge me to a debate in a venue that I could never fulfill. And therefore, I don't know.
Right.
But he kept inviting me on. Oh, you should come on. You should, this and that. And I'm like, look, I mean, if Lofton wants to turn around and go back on his word, then okay, sure, but and pay me, then I suppose I could. I'm providing content for a show whose agenda I am opposed to, and I know I'm opposed to the show's agenda because Eric Ibarra is a co-host on it. And after reading through his blog and his Facebook comments for quite a while, I'm not going to support him. So finally, someone said, one of his fangirls said, why don't you schedule a debate this time? And Eric goes, yeah, we can do that. And any Orthodox venue will do, but not Jay Dyer's.
No surprise there.
Right. And I'm like, all right, sure. And we haggled it out. And we settled on Ahmad Lewis. We settled, Lewis. We've settled on a date and a time. Eric scheduled, I think it was February 8th, or February, I can't remember the date. We said it would be on any of the articles I've written. And we set up basic rules for the debate. And Eric agreed to it. And 8 hours later, he backed out of it, saying, I did not know that you were associated with Jay. I thought you were someone else. And I am not doing this now. So then I offered, well, how about if we change the mod? He also wanted me to adjust material in one of my articles. And I said, no, I'm not going to adjust what I write to make you happy. Your feelings are not my problem. Mm-hmm. But he then backed out of it. And then when I posted something on Facebook pointing that out, he blocked me.
Yeah, and that's typical of Ibarra, to be honest. But let's talk about.
I mean, my thing is this, if I might say, I'm not a big fan of debates. If I challenged him to a debate and he had said, well, to be honest, I think that a debate is a horrible venue in which to discuss the topic. I would rather do an essay war. I would have said, okay, that's fine. I don't think any less of him for not wanting to do a debate. What I do think is ridiculous is repeatedly challenging someone to one and then agreeing on it and then backing out at the last.
Yeah, this is what they do. This is what Albrecht did. Albrecht did this to me for like 6 months, after a year and a half of debate me. Okay, I'll debate you in 6 months. And then 6 months later, I'll debate you again in 6 months. And then, I'll debate you again in 6. So the third time, I'm done with that. I'm not doing it. It's a waste of time.
Is Albrecht the one who's always angry?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Let's talk about Ubi. Do you think that let's start with Jay, actually. Jay, do you think the current state of the Catholic Church puts into jeopardy the papal claims? Do you think it refutes the papal claims?
I think that's one of the clearest ways to see that it is refuted. I think that the if you look at a document like Mortalium Animos and you compare it to the documents of Vatican II or Nostra Aetate, you would see a very clear contrast and contradiction. So I think that's one of the easiest ways. Another, if you're committed to Roman Catholic or if you're looking into Roman Catholicism, I would say get the Tan book, Popes Against the Modern Errors. This is a collection from Tan publishers of the top condemnations of errors from papal encyclicals from the last few hundred years, right? So you've got this easy way to see what the popes have taught in their ordinary and extraordinary magisterial teachings. And then you compare that to what you've seen, not just at Vatican II, Nostra Aetate, or the Assisi gathering, but now at the Amazon Synod and the Pachamama example. You can just see the most clear night and day situation. So I couldn't think of a better way that, in my view, God's providence has made it manifest to the entire world. Not just from the pedo scandals and that kind of stuff, because we can always say, well, there's corruption, and it's from the top down though, right? So saying that there's corruption okay, that's one thing. I think the pedo stuff is like next level corruption. But even if we were to not base it on just the insane level of like mafia, cult, pedo corruption, if we just looked at the theology, you can clearly see a contradiction between the pre-Vatican II teachings and the post-Vatican II teachings.
Definitely.
Would you like to elaborate on that, or Ubi? Do you think this is a fundamental problem, or do you think the history is more powerful? Or
I would say both. I would say the history in itself pretty much refutes it, but I would also add that, the papacy painted itself into a corner with the First Vatican Council. Agreed. There's no coming out of that.
That's a good point.
This is something that's less historical, but I think these are two arguments that Roman Catholics will often resort to, as they did in the Taylor-Marshall and Flanders stream. They'll resort to these arguments for the papacy that have absolutely nothing to do with the history, oftentimes because they will take a development of doctrine view. So there's two aspects to this. There's one aspect which is that, well, epistemologically, we need the buck to stop somewhere for us to know what true councils are. Mm-hmm. And one example that is brought up to go against reception theory, for example, is that Chalcedon was not received by the church universally. A whole see rejected it, right? And the second aspect, so I would like Jay to comment on both of these and then Ubi comment on both of these. The second aspect is the pragmatic aspect. Well, Orthodox haven't had an ecumenical council since 787, says Taylor-Marshall, Dr. Taylor-Marshall. And there is absolutely no way, they have no potency to be able to actually, the Orthodox, to convene a universal council to make universal dogmas anymore. Whereas we, at least with the Pope, the Pope is our way out. At least we have a way out. But the Orthodox don't. What would you say about the epistemological question, Jay, and the pragmatic question?
First thing I would say is that argument falls back on their own head, because if the church must have ecumenical councils to know how to function and govern, then their own church didn't function and govern for the first 300 years because they didn't have any ecumenical councils until Nicaea. So that's a dumb argument, first of all. Secondly, the normative functioning of the church is not ecumenical councils, but is local synods. And that's what existed for the first 300 years. The Orthodox Church has continued that synodal form of government ever since the schism. So I would say that this is really a weak argument. And then in response, the Roman Catholic is really not in a better position epistemically or pragmatically. They might think that they are, but when you've actually been in the world of Rome, you can see that it's not actually that way. Everybody has the problem of having individual certitude, and you can't solve it by just moving the problem back a step with an external, visible, single dude over there. Because you still have the problem of the individual interpreting that guy's writings or that guy's works, or trying to delineate between ordinary magisterium and extraordinary magisterium, right? So just saying that, that guy will solve the problem, it just moves the problem back a step, right? And if you've been in the world of Roman Catholicism, you know that it doesn't actually work. There are as many different views of what authentic Catholicism is as there are rites and groups and schisms within Roman Catholicism, right? Is authentic Catholicism the SSPX? Is it the FSSP? Is it the Diocesan Latin Mass? Is it Francis's Clown Mass? Is it the Jesuit James Martin? You have all of this stuff. Is it Uniatism, which rejects Trent and many other councils after, right, has basically Orthodox theology for the most part, reveres Palamos. Is that within the bounds of Roman Catholicism? Well, yes, because ultimately it's just a system that allows you to have all kinds of different views, all kinds of different confessions, two different creeds within that church, as long as you believe in the authority of the Bishop of Rome, basically temporal authority. So it's really a position that's based in the worship of authority, and it doesn't even grant the epistemic certitude that it claims to. And the mere fact that Taylor Marshall and his crew now position themselves as these trads. I was arguing with Taylor Marshall 10 years ago when he didn't even position himself as a quasi FSSP, SSPX level trad guy. Well, now he's that guy. Look, I've been there. I understand. I get it. But it illustrates the absurdity of saying that I'm a Catholic, our religion is solved by the Pope, but by the way, don't listen to the last 60 plus years of what the papacy has dogmatically taught. So it doesn't achieve the thing that it's supposed to achieve. And I think that is very evident to people who are familiar with that world of Roman Catholicism.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's it's a wild world out there. I mean, I was talking with a relative of mine who is he goes to the Latin Mass, and he was telling me about how in order for there to be a union or reunion between the SSPX and the FSSP, well, we need to first, and he's FSSP, he said we need to first, what's the term I'm looking for? Not to come to terms, but we need to, help me out here.
Accept
dialogue.
I think he said come to terms with the diocesan church or something like that. It was a stronger word than come to terms, and it was my mind goes blank now. But and it in other words, what he was trying to say, and as the conversation went on, and I began to ask him questions, what became very clear was that he looked at the SSPX as sort of like traitors to the FSSP, and that the FSSP was like the real church, sort of like, the within the Catholic
within
Church.
the church, the real church. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the real church within the church, and that, we were holding on to it. I know in the Catholic diocese I live in, which is, quite large, I calculated once that there were roughly about half.
Roughly about what? You cut out there.
He might have his internet might have cut out.
Okay.
Well,
while he's coming back, one point I wanted to make on the epistemology that touches on our previous discussion is that you're not really in a better position. I have to stress that in regard to circularity. Again, the Roman Catholic epistemology, what's dogmatic for their anthropology via Vatican I, via the acceptance of Thomism as the official philosophy of the Church, you can't accept circular argumentation. That's not acceptable at all, really, within the Roman Catholic world. And yet, we find that at a very fundamental level, the Roman Catholic position, as I've said many times, is circular. And I think this is problematic because the office of the papacy is proven by the Scriptures. The Scriptures give us the office of the papacy. You wouldn't know the canon of Scripture according to Roman Catholic Apologetics unless you had been listening to the Pope and the later Latin synods that determine the Deuterocanon is included. And so that's how we know what the canon is. Yet, at the same time, it's the Scriptures that ultimately prove the papacy. And this is literally a circular argument. Now, as an Orthodox person, I admit that at a fundamental level, truth claims, authority claims of necessity are going to ultimately be circular. It's unavoidable. But my point here, my argument is very specific, that within the Roman Catholic anthropology, epistemology, you can't have circular argumentation. It's completely contrary to that dogma and that view of man, that anthropology, right? Just like you can't have a doctrine of the nous within Roman Catholicism because they've already really settled on a specific dual view of man's nature, body, soul/intellect. there's not really any place for the doctrine of the nous. Now, there could be uniates who confess belief in the nous, but it's not really consistent with the development of the Latin theology. So the point is just that, again, you've got these dogmas in the trad world, and they don't comport with the way that you justify and explain and give an account for the dogmas of papacy, of the certitude of the office of the papacy, how the papacy is going to give you supposedly certitude, because it's all based in circular type of argumentation. And for the trad, they don't mind that, right? They're so, yeah, so what? The papacy confirms the scriptures confirm the papacy. But now why do you rely on a circular argument, right? That's more of a transcendental argument. Transcendental arguments can't fit with Roman Catholic dogma, epistemology, and anthropology. It just doesn't work. It's a violation of the very way that Vatican I tells you go about proving to yourself the dogma of the papacy. It says, what do? Go to history, look at the history, look at these Bible verses. These prove the papacy. Look at the history of the, yeah. So you're using this sort of evidential approach, right? But the evidential approach relies on you as an individual, subjectively, psychologically, coming to and knowing the truth, right? So the office of the papacy is constructed, supposedly, if you read Denzinger, you'll see condemned proposition. What's the point of a condemned proposition if the individual Catholic can't read that and know what the condemned propositions are so that he can avoid the heresies, right? So it presupposes, on the one hand, that the individual can have that certitude, and yet 95% of their argumentation is based on individuals not having certitude. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I just want to check if Ubi is back.
I see him. He must he's hopping in and out, so he must be having some connection issues.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to say something because I think you dealt with it in a sense, but I heard Roman Catholic apologist talking recently, and he said, "Oh well, it's not a circular argument. It's a spiral argument because what we do is we go to the texts, as if they were just historical documents, right. And then we find out all this stuff about the papacy, and then we accept as divine revelation, and then it spirals and confirms itself in that way."
Yeah, I would say that's sophistry. I mean, he's trying to use a false analogy of a spiral instead of a circle. I mean, yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, first of all, the texts don't present themselves as any other text. They present themselves as divinely inspired text, right? So scriptures are not like every other document. This is the problem of the normie basic bitch evidentialist apologetics. So it presumes neutrality on the part of the opponent. The opponent is
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, the opponent's not in a neutral position, so I would say that that alone shows that the stupidity of that argumentation. Because if you're granting neutrality to the opponent, then you're admitting that you're admitting classical foundationalism, and classical foundationalism can't you can't redefine stuff as a spiral argument instead of a circular argument. That's ridiculous. Where were we, Ubi? You were talking about I forgot what. Remind us where we were.
He was talking about the FSSP being a true church.
Yeah, I wanted to hear this point, right?
Yes, the thing is, in the Catholic diocese in which I live, and it is a very large diocese, I calculated that there are about, I think it was a total of 0.5% of the Catholics are Latin Mass goers. That was it. I mean, it's very small for like this. They think that they're going to like burst out.
I think you cut out again. Yeah, well, I think that's a good testament to the fact that the number. Are you there, Jay?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I just thought that would be a good testament to the fact that the numbers argument doesn't really work, because on the one hand you're going to claim numbers, but then on the other hand only 0.5% of all Catholics are trad.
It's just like the truly reformed. If you're a Calvinist, like TR, like the true trad is the Latin Mass goer. But yeah, I mean, when I attended the Latin Mass, I went to the SSPX for many years in Memphis.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
It was the same situation in Memphis. Like the diocesan Latin Mass was one chapel in the whole diocese of Memphis, and it had maybe maybe 50, 100 people that would go there. And the SSPX chapel had more like 20 or 30 in Memphis. And I did that for many years. So I know the lay of the land for the SSPX, like in, Tennessee area. So you're talking out of however many, probably hundreds of thousands of Catholics right throughout the whole of Memphis, Arkansas, Tennessee. And you've got 200-300 people going to the Latin Mass. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be a little more now. It might be a little more now, but so what?
Yeah, I mean, another 50 years, the Latin Mass will be dead.
Yeah, they're talking about getting rid of it now. Yeah.
Right. It will exist in the SSPX, and in the actual Catholic Church, it will probably be much like the Ambrosian Rite or the Milanese Rite. It will just be some little, local thing here or there, and more or less a tourist attraction.
So the Diocese of Middle Tennessee, which is not Memphis, is estimated at 70,000. Let me see what Memphis is. So this is just funny to look at these numbers because, yeah, like Lewis said, it's all about them numbers. We got the billions, right? Catholic population of Memphis is something like, what does it say, 25,000 in Memphis. So you're talking, maybe 100,000, 200,000 throughout all of Tennessee. And the Latin Mass goers are like literally a few hundred. So that's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And I would add one last thing too from the Chieti document, the Chieti. How do you say it, Lewis? I don't know Italian. Chieti.
Well, I call it Chieti, but that might be incorrect. Maybe Ubi would know.
Chieti.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you notice 13 there, and I'm bringing this up because it kind of illustrates the point. So the Vatican can put out these theological commission documents, and of course every Roman Catholic, it's not infallible. Of course, it's not infallible unless it's useful to them to prove something they believe, right? If Ratzinger writes a book about something like celibacy in the priesthood, that's basically infallible, right? But if there's something that they don't like, suddenly then the document doesn't even matter. Now the Pope has confirmed this document. This is a Vatican confirmed document. And you'll notice the admissions in that document are very significant for the things that we talked about at the beginning of the stream with Ratzinger, right? Ratzinger talking about the modus operandi of the Eastern Church for the first millennium still being basically being the norm, right? The Church.
And he republished that as Pope.
Oh, good. Yeah, and you'll notice that the document there from the Vatican in point 13 essentially still makes this point. Now, I'm not saying that we as Orthodox agree with everything in this document, but the point is that this document is approved by the Vatican. It reflects the current Vatican's attitude, at least back to Ratzinger, probably back to John Paul II as well. And that is completely contrary to all of the stuff that you hear from the Roman Catholic Apologetic. These are huge admissions for the Orthodox position.
Show paragraph 19. I think it's the end of paragraph 19 is really telling.
Let me pull that one up too. And the point is that when this kind of stuff comes up, what is the response of an Ibarra or a Marshall or any of these people for whom the office of the papacy is supposed to be this make it all easy thing? This was Flanders' whole argument, make it all, it's all easy now. Oh, really? What about when the papacy backs us up? Oh, no, in that case, we throw this out. This is all liberalism. It doesn't matter. I don't accept this document. So they're Protestants. They pick and choose.
It's a papacy on their terms.
Exactly. Well put. Yeah.
It's a sock puppet papacy, which...
Yeah, it's a platonic form of papacy. It's the invisible church of the Calvinists applied to the papacy, that it's in their head.
Right. I think arguably the proper, according to the dogmas, the proper way to deal with Pope Francis would be to just submit to all his ordinary magisterium and basically just pray for God to, change the situation eventually. I think I could be wrong about that.
Jay, you brought up in the video that you did when you, right after you were received into the Orthodox Church, you brought up a very good point about trad Catholics. And that is, whenever things are not going well, they just go, well, Fatima.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Oh, this percentage of the priests in Chicago or whatever city it was were arrested for pedophilia. They were tipping each other. I think it was Chicago. I read about this a while ago. Well, Fatima, I remember like seeing a guy with a baseball hat that had Fatima on it. I mean, you pull up to the Latin Mass church, it's like the Fatima, the Fatima bumper sticker. It's like, well, you got the pro-life one. I like that, but like the Fatima one too. I mean, it's just sort of like it's like in third world countries, people have this dream of coming to Europe or to the U.S. It's just their dream. They know it will never happen, right? Well, for them, it's the same. It's Fatima, right? Yeah. Fatima said this or that. And even as a Roman Catholic attending the Latin Mass, I never understood Fatima. Yeah. I never bought into it.
Me neither.
It always seemed so odd. And it was just like assumed, like, well, do I even have to say the F word for you to know, what's really going on? The F word. Do I really have to say it, or are you in the know, right? Have you fetishized this, bizarre apparition properly, like the rest of us have? And it's an escape for them. But I mean, right. That aside, they're not in a good situation, and I don't miss being in that bizarre situation with the whole Fatima thing. But
it's a replacement. It's a stupid prelest delusion. It's a replacement for knowing actual theology and the scriptures. I met so many trads who couldn't tell me the Ten Commandments, but they knew all these stupid details and conspiracy theories about Fatima. And I just always thought it was ridiculous.
Right. I mean, World War I will end in 1917. Well, no, it didn't. It was almost 1919. Almost 1919 when it ended. I mean, what, a month and a few days short. But speaking of prelist, I saw the Timothy Flanders interview. That was something else when he claimed that the schism was entirely because of his pride. Or was it because of or entirely because of?
Just because of.
Because of, wow. That's, that is some staunch ego masturbation right there.
Yeah, but don't you know, but he said he was humble bizarre. Like 28 times. So that the humility that he obtained by submitting to a guy who claims to be basically the God Emperor, that's humility, right?
I mean, it's like, of all the have you ever met someone who felt the need to tell you how good they were at something and then they were actually good at it?
In some cases, yeah. Rarely, but yeah.
Okay. Rarely, right? Okay. I think it's the same thing. When someone feels the need to tell you how humble they are, they're probably quite arrogant. They're probably quite prideful. And going on about how, like, oh, the schism is because of me. And I can just picture right now, the Pope wakes up in the morning and he goes, we could heal this now. And then looks over at this icon of Timothy Flanders and goes, except for his pride. And, tears up the document he had on the table. It's like, well, there was unity. Take it back to Cardinal Humbert. I didn't want to excommunicate Carolarius, but looks up at an icon of Timothy Flanders.
Yeah,
he's just so proud. Signs it. It was bizarre. And then I saw part of the episode where he got his rejoinder, and he's talking about reading Thomas à Kempis and. Is this filioquist heresy? What is this? It's like, the extreme emotionalism involved in all of it is very disturbing.
Yeah.
Your emotions are the last thing you want to start following. They're fickle.
Exactly.
They're dangerous, and they lead you down paths like claiming that you're humble 28 times. It was just bizarre.
Yeah, I think that was one of the worst arguments I've ever heard for Roman Catholicism. Just read Thomas à Kempis, bro. Wow. Yeah, I mean, if that's what they're falling back on, we don't have much to worry about. All right,
Yeah.
so we go ahead and move to the super chats. We've been going for almost 2.5 hours here, so we'll go ahead and read some of these. And if you want to support us, guys, if you want to, please leave us a super chat question. We will read them all. Answer your questions. Blake Tyson, $10. He says, do you believe the Roman Church has lost sacramental grace and jurisdiction? I have asked several priests, and I cannot get a clear answer. One said that I can go to a Roman Catholic priest for confession. My answer to that would be no. They do not have sacramental grace. There can be situations where the baptism might, in a certain case, be accepted. Again, like if a Melkite or somebody like that, like practice a baptism, it would be, the same way that we do baptism. So that's why the Orthodox Church has economia and the different means by which local bishops and priests receive converts, because everybody's situation is different. So that might be why you've got different responses from these people. At the same time, too, many people have the wrong conception about sacraments in other churches. The Roman Catholic Church does not have the Eucharist. They don't have like anything close to the right form. The bread is wrong. They forbid the laity. And you can talk about, in a sense, a kind of apostolic succession. But if you don't have the faith, it doesn't really matter, right? So this is a difficult discussion that gets into sacramentology. That's not the place to go into that. But for the simple answer is just no. Like you can't get confession from a Roman Catholic priest. No. And it's not Orthodox to say that you can. That guy's wrong. Do you guys have any responses to that?
No, I mean, I'm not. I haven't really. It's whether or not the Catholic Church has sacramental grace is not really something I speculate about. I just know that there is grace in the Orthodox Church. There's the fullness of grace. So I leave it at that, and I move on.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm very surprised.
We can't tell an Orthodox person that they can go get confession from a Roman Catholic priest, I think is what he's
asking. No, absolutely. Yeah, no, right. You could not do that. That is unacceptable.
Right.
But whether there's grace
that weirded me out
there, I don't. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, if that priest knew, I mean, if you are already a Roman, let's say, I mean, like maybe whoever's asking this question was already a Roman Catholic, and they went to an Orthodox priest and asked this question, and the Orthodox priest might have just said, well, you can continue to receive confession in the Roman Catholic Church until you become Orthodox. Maybe that's what he was saying, if I was thinking. But if you are already Orthodox and you're a catechumen, like it would be business. It's like that's totally out of order. To tell someone who's Orthodox to go receive confession from a Roman Catholic priest. No way.
Yeah. So basic answer, no. Mark Bradshaw, $2. Thank you, Mark Bradshaw. Much appreciated for that super chat. Thomas W, $5. He says, 7 trads are autistically screeching and thumbing down this video. Well, that's okay because we've got like 150 thumbs up. So let the trads be mad. It's okay. We expect it. Don, $20. He says, is there a PDF of the Confession of St. Sophronius in any language, preferably English? Keep up the good work and God bless. Yes, actually, in my Discord, we do have the PDF version of that book. So it is in there. So Don, if you can find a way to just pay attention maybe to my Twitter the next time we open up the Discord for debates, I'll put a link up and you can come in there and find access to that document. Nicodemus the Pharisee, £10. He says, Satis cognitum and quartus supra, quote St. Maximus saying, if a man does not want to be called a heretic, let him hasten before all things to communion with the Roman See. Do you guys have any thoughts on this? Actually, these are the actual quotes, the kinds of quotes that Ubi has been dealing with lately at his blog. He's actually responding to Ibarra right now, most recently on the Maximus quotes. Is that right?
Yeah, they're in the articles. If you go and look up Saint Maximus on the blog, I handle that. It's in 3 parts.
Awesome.
Part 3 isn't out yet.
Okay, so yeah, so
Oh,
if you,
sorry, no, sorry, part two, two parts. I believe it's in part two. I handle that one.
so if you look in the link in the description of the show, in the paragraph, you'll see a link to Ubi's blog, and the last two responses have been responding to Ibarra on Maximus and those kinds of quotes. Alfonso Corral for $5. Thank you, Alfonso. Much appreciated. Jeff Blonsky says for $5. Jay, could you comment on the Nestorian ecclesiology of Vatican II, Lumen Gentium number 8? Oh, that the church subsists in the Catholic Church. Yeah, I think that that is a loose application of Nestorianism to ecclesiology. If the church is the body of Christ, then you can't have the body of Christ outside the body of Christ. That makes no sense, right? So again, this gets really nuanced in terms of the sacramentology, but the Orthodox view is neither Roman. It's not the Roman Catholic ex opere operato view, and it's not the Donatist view. So some people kind of get confused about this. It's neither one, and we have a tradition again of economia. So there's not like an easy Roman Catholic. Well, the Roman Catholics just accept anything that's X, Y, Z. Well, we're a little more specific because of the ancient canons. The ancient canons have pretty specific like requirements about types of baptisms that aren't accepted. And anyway, long story short, we don't specifically say, like Ubi said, there's no grace outside of the sacramental walls of the church, right? Because that puts us in a position that's almost Donatistic, where, oh, well, then anybody who has a wrong opinion, I'm going to end up being a true Orthodox, because anybody who has a wrong opinion is in heresy, and oh, now they've lost grace, right? So that leads to schism. So there's a balance that has to be found here that can't easily be answered due to the fact that it's a case-by-case basis how people are received at different times. And that's because of the various canons. There's Canon 8 of Nicaea. There's canons in the Trullo Synod that talk about different ways of people being received, whether it's schismatic bishops or whether it's people in heresy or whether it's people who are newly converting. Typically, right? Typically it's baptism, but not in every single case, right? John Damascus says that we can accept even baptism if it's done in the appropriate way. That doesn't mean that they have all of the sacramental graces per se. He says that the grace is in a way effectual when they enter the church. So it's not to say that we absolutely deny grace outside the church, but we don't know, right? So we don't presume to judge every single person's soul who's, Grandma Baptist or whatever, right? We don't judge everybody's soul, but we do say, and we tell them that they have the duty to become Orthodox. So Lumen Gentium is basically, in a way, expanding. If you read Father Peter Harris's book on Vatican II, he'll talk about this too, that Lumen Gentium is kind of expanding the notion of what it is to be the body of Christ beyond the bounds of the church to any sect, and by extension, Nostra Aetate then applies that to even foreign false religions, right? Hinduism, all those religions become sort of vehicles for the body of Christ, which again is totally foreign to the mind of the church fathers. Now, I'm aware that Maximus and many church fathers teach that Christ assumed universal human nature, and so that's the basis that we believe in recapitulation and all that. So recapitulation has to come into play here too. But again, we have the human vantage point where we don't know what everybody else's status is, where they are. We know that the gospel is preached to the dead, so we allow for the possibility that the grace of God can reach anyone, yet we have the duty to call people to the visible body of Christ. So we ultimately would have to reject Lumen Gentium there as definitely a Nestorian view of the church. I think that's true. This book is pretty good. I mean, there's a couple points I don't agree with everything that Father Harris says, but his study of Vatican II on this very issue is really good for the most part. Like 95% I would agree with. So you can get his book on that very topic. Anybody else have any comments? I don't want to monopolize the chat. If you guys want to say anything about Vatican II and the idea of the church being, beyond the church, so to speak.
No, I'd agree with what you say.
No, I don't really have anything either.
I think you recommend usually people take a look at that talk that Father Whiteford did, right?
Oh, on the rebaptism controversy, yes. This is one of the rare occasions I would recommend to go to Reason and Theology and watch Father John Whiteford's interview on rebaptism, because it
the two that we'll recommend.
He explains nuance. He explains that it's not so simple. It's not as simple as the Roman Catholics let it on to be.
Yeah, so there's only 3 Reason and Theologies we'll recommend. My debate. I'm joking. So Bradshaw and Whiteford on Reason and Theology are good ones. So, by the way, Dr. Bradshaw on Reason and Theology, he goes on there and says everything that I say and what does Lofton say. Well, he's still not saying what Jay says. Yes, he is. Get over it, dude.
Yeah. I watched the Bradshaw episode, and it was very good. And what was most entertaining was the way that they just kind of nodded and smiled at Dr. Bradshaw. It was that kind of like, yeah, like you're here, and just smile. Kind of look. Other than those 2 episodes, Dr. Whiteford was very good. Other than those 2 episodes, I mean, watching Reason and Theology, it's like watching women try and parallel park. It would be funny if it were not so
disastrous.
If it wasn't such a waste of time. I mean, they've had some good guests on there, and I really applaud Craig Trulia for going on there and trying to present what he sees as the Orthodox side. And but I think that I don't think most of their episodes are really that good. I mean, for organized debates and everything, and wouldn't recommend it. But those 2 episodes are good.
Here's an interesting question from Emil. Thank you for that super chat, $5, Emil. This kind of gets at an argument I've been making, which related to like the canons. If you look at the way canons are presented,
what's the question?
I haven't read it yet. If you look at the way canons are presented, the way canons come about in the councils, the way they're viewed as patterns of normative judgment, case law type judgment, you see that the very process of canons is synodal. It's collegial, right? And Emil asked the question in a similar way about like when a patriarch writes a letter and, basically sends it to the other patriarchates and bishoprics and says, do you find this to be the Orthodox faith, right? If you look at the Confession of St. Sophronius, he writes that, the Sixth Council investigates it, they say this is the Orthodox faith. Very similar to what happens with the Tome of Leo, right? It's written, everybody looks at it, that's what we believe. That's the model that we saw earlier tonight in Acts 15. Peter says this, Barnabas and Paul say this, the Old Testament says this, James says this. We all think this is the apostolic faith. And Emil is asking the question about the synodal aspect of the Confession of St. Sophronius, that he writes this letter and he says, do you think that these kind of letters, when they write this at their inauguration, does it itself kind of invalidate the Roman Catholic papal claim? Why would they state that the councils affirmed the faith of the fathers? He's saying, why would they state councils they accept in a Vatican I framework? I think you're right, because it's after the first millennium that you have the switch in how bishops and patriarchs come to be. In Rome, the Pope of Rome decides everything. It's not that way, obviously, for the first millennium. So why even have like the Patriarch of Jerusalem write a letter and say, here's my confession, everybody else, do you agree it's Orthodox? That's synodal. You see what I'm saying? That very modus operandi itself is an argument against the Vatican I view. Does that make sense?
It does, yes.
Lewis, what do you think?
Yeah, I would. I'd agree with that analysis. Yeah.
So the praxis of the church for the first millennium itself is not the Vatican I mindset, and that itself is a very strong argument.
Well, and on top of that, to add to that, you do see this attitude within Catholic apologetics that it is the Pope versus the Council.
Yeah.
And you see this picked up by Orthodox apologetics as well, as opposed to understanding that the Pope is within the Council. He is the leader of it. Mm-hmm. They're all moving in a direction together, not the Pope standing there going, now you guys go to the right and you guys stay where you are, and you guys, no, he's going there with them.
Yeah. ML adds to that, and he says, right, if they all had the Vatican I mindset, wouldn't they all just say, my confession is what the Pope says? I mean, wouldn't they just say, I believe what Damasus says? I believe what, like, why would you have the process of writing your confession of faith and sending it to the other patriarchates to be approved? I would just say, well, what does Rome say?
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's very pertinent to note that for example, the whole purpose of an ex cathedra is to solve big contentious issues of their time. And I mean, for the life of me, if the Pope has a special promise from God divinely appointed that when he speaks from the chair, he speaks infallibly and he's preserved by the Holy Spirit from error, why don't we have an ex cathedra against like the biggest heresies of the first millennium of Arianism, Nestorianism?
There should have been one by one ex cathedras down the line.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But no, it's only. I mean, like as you said before, Roman Catholics will debate forever how many ex cathedras there are. Mm-hmm. Like the scholars all take different views.
Right.
Like.
Well, the answer that they give as to why there were councils versus ex cathedra statements is because they say, well, some things were better. It was better to handle it in council because people had to make public professions, and it would hold them to it more if they had to publicly profess this or that. And ultimately, that's a ridiculous argument because prior to the Council of Chalcedon, when Leo sent out his tome, and you have bishops signing on to it, Leo did not want a council. He thought sending out the tome and having bishops sign it and agree to it was more than enough. The council was called because the emperor told him he was going to call a council and told Pope St. Leo, you were going to send legates. And the Pope, just like every other bishop, said when the emperor pays for it, you do it. Likewise with the libellus of Hormisdas, which is a whole other issue. And I'm actually... probably the end of this year, maybe beginning of next year, I'm going to start translating letters from Latin involving in between Pope St. Hormisdas, St. Justinian, and John of Cappadocia, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Epiphanius, and others, because they're very important to understanding that situation. But with the libellus of Hormisdas, he did not think that you needed a council. The emperor actually requested one, and Hormisdas said, no, you can just sign the document. So this idea that they needed a council to publicly discuss things it's special pleading.
Yeah, good point. All right, that's all the super chats I see. We've gone for a good 2 hours and 45 minutes. It's been a great talk. Thank you, Ubi, for joining me. Thank you, Lewis, for helping to MC this. A lot of great points, a lot of stuff I didn't know. Always enjoy learning new facts. Thank you very much for that. Check out his blog if you want to get really deep into the specifics of a lot of the arguments that Ibarra has made and a lot of the bad argumentation that he's used. See it refuted from from a scholarly vantage point. So definitely follow his blog, and I'm sure if you would like to, Ubi's welcome to come back anytime. Lewis as well. Thank you guys for
thank you so much
joining me. Yeah, and what's your future projection for the blog? What can we expect in their future?
We're going to start. At first, thank you so much for having me on. It has been an honor and a real pleasure. I've been a long time listener, first time caller, so to say.
Okay.
Long time listener, first time guest. At the moment, we are working on a few things, and I like to keep things a surprise. But we have been getting a lot of requests for articles on St. Photius, a lot of requests. Okay. And as I mentioned, end of this year, beginning of next, I'm going to start translating letters on the occasion or the schism of Akakios, where the libellus of Pope St. Hormisdas is published. And skimming these letters, you start to realize there is a reason why they only translate this one tiny part, the quote unquote libellus, why they only translate that. And the reason is all of the rest of the documents show that the situation was completely out of control of the Pope's hands, that he was bargained down, and that he uses certain phrases in certain ways, and it does not mean what they think it does. It's much more benign than you would think. In fact, he even allows, in one letter that I saw someone had gotten translated, I saw it on his Facebook, it becomes clear that the Pope actually allowed people to write their own libelli. And it was actually, yeah, he did. Right? He actually allowed them to write their own. And we have some of these libelli, right?
Oh, wow. Okay.
And most of them don't mention the Petrine claims. At all, and it's fairly shocking. But you'll see this quote floating around about 2,500 bishops signed it. It doesn't say that in Latin. It says 2,500 priests. But it was only it was only Constantinople that signed it, and it was only, I believe, that patriarch. It was brought back later at a later council, but yeah, that's sort of what we're working on.
The other thing is we're also, let's keep it a surprise. Okay. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Heavy scholarly stuff, but if you want to see detailed refutations of the so-called greatest apologist of our day, Eric Ibarra, according to Flanders, go to Ubi Petrus and you can see it there. And they will be expanding, too, to do a lot more responses, as we said, to St. Photius and others. So it's not just an anti-Ibarra blog. There's a lot more that's going to be going on there. So, but thank you guys for your excellent work, and look forward to having you guys back on in the near future.
Thanks for having us on.
All right. Y'all have a good night. God bless.